The world ended on a Tuesday morning, the 23rd of October, 2077, 9:13 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. The first missiles were detected on a military network called the Integrated Operational Nuclear Detection System, and from the moment that alarm sounded, civilization had roughly 2 hours left. That is the single most important piece of information the Fallout universe ever gives you, and the games themselves never fully agree on who pulled the trigger first. Section 1. The Great War. Who really started the end of the world? There is a specific kind of quiet that settles over a story when you realize that the central event, the catastrophe that every character, every faction, every broken building and sun-bleached highway was born from, might not have had a single clear cause. The Great War in Fallout is that kind of event. It is the wound the world cannot close. And for decades, the games let you walk through its aftermath without ever being fully honest about how it started. Fallout as a series drops you into a world that is exactly 2 centuries removed from the moment the bombs fell. The grass has been dead for 200 years. The cars are still in the streets because no one ever came back to move them. The canned food still lines the shelves of collapsed supermarkets, preserved by radiation in sealed containers, because the people who were meant to eat it never came home. Everything you touch in the wasteland is a fragment of that morning, that one specific Tuesday when humanity decided it had run out of options. The games are rich with detail about the decades leading up to the war. The Resource Wars began in 2052, a slow and grinding conflict driven by the collapse of global petroleum reserves. Oil prices climbed past any sustainable point, economies buckled, and the United States and China entered a cold slide toward open conflict that lasted a quarter century. The Sino-American War, which began officially in 2066, sent American forces to Alaska to protect oil pipeline infrastructure after Chinese troops invaded the peninsula. Operation Anchorage, referenced constantly throughout the games and explored directly in a Fallout 3 downloadable add-on, was the campaign that reclaimed Anchorage from Chinese occupation, a victory sold to the American public as a triumph, even as the larger war ground on without resolution. By 2077, American forces were fighting on the Chinese mainland. The NCR, the Brotherhood of Steel, the Enclave, all of these factions that defined the later Fallout games were born from the institutions that prosecuted that war. The U.S. military, the government's shadow agencies, the corporations that supplied them, everything traces back. But who fired the first nuclear weapon? That question sat unanswered for most of Fallout's history. The early games, the original 1997 Fallout and its 1998 sequel, never addressed it directly. The world was already ruined when you arrived. The cause was somewhere behind you in history, and the game seemed more interested in what you were going to do about the present than in relitigating 2 centuries of blame. Which, honestly, makes a kind of philosophical sense. You cannot rebuild a world by arguing endlessly about how it was destroyed, but that ambiguity left a mystery at the very heart of the lore. A war of this scale, with targets this widespread and casualties this total, had to start somewhere. Someone had to blink first. The most common assumption, reinforced by the general tone of the games, was that China fired the opening salvo. Fallout's version of pre-war America is depicted as propagandistic, nationalistic, and morally compromised, but the Chinese government is portrayed as the immediate aggressor in Alaska. The invasion of Anchorage was a Chinese military operation. The submarine Yangtze, which you encounter in Fallout 4 sitting rusted and silent off the coast of Boston, was a Chinese nuclear submarine. Its ghoul captain Zhao has spent 200 years carrying the weight of the missiles he launched on the morning of the Great War. When you speak to him, he tells you directly. He confirms it. He launched them. He was following orders. And for 200 years, he has sat in that metal tomb with nothing but the sound of the ocean and the memory of what he did. That exchange is one of the most quietly devastating moments in Fallout 4. Here is a man who has outlived his entire civilization, his country, his navy, his commanding officers, the politicians who gave him those orders, everyone who ever agreed that launching nuclear weapons was necessary, and he is still there, breathing recycled air, grieving in a language the world around him has forgotten. Tim Kaine, who co-created the original Fallout, gave a more concrete answer in an October 2023 interview with a YouTuber called TK's Mantis. Kaine confirmed that in his original vision, China fired first. But the reason China fired was significant. The United States had been developing the forced evolutionary virus, the FEV, the biological agent that would eventually give rise to super mutants, and when China learned of those bioweapon experiments, they treated it as a red line. The US refused to stop. Tensions reached a point where China calculated that waiting would be fatal, so they fired. There is something important about that framing. It does not let the United States off the hook. You cannot look at a nation that was secretly engineering a virus capable of rewriting human biology and describe them as purely innocent. The FEV research was monstrous. The American government's refusal to stop it, even as nuclear tensions peaked, reflects the same logic that every warmongering bureaucracy has ever used: the belief that the program was too valuable to abandon, that the strategic advantage was worth the diplomatic risk, that the other side would blink first. They did not blink first. But here is where the story gets genuinely complicated. Because the Fallout television series on Amazon Prime, which is considered canonical to the franchise, confirmed by Bethesda director Todd Howard, introduced a third explanation that changes the moral landscape entirely. The show suggests, through a series of revelations built around the character of Cooper Howard and the pre-war activities of Vault-Tec executives, that it was Vault-Tec itself that initiated the first nuclear strike. Not China, not the American government, a corporation. A company that had built its entire identity around the inevitability of nuclear war, that had lobbied and schemed to make itself indispensable to government survival planning, and that had ultimately decided the only way to guarantee its own relevance was to make sure the catastrophe actually happened. The logic is chilling precisely because it is recognizable. Vault-Tec needed the war. Without the war, the vaults were just expensive holes in the ground. Without the war, the government contracts dried up, the shareholders got nervous, and the whole enterprise of Project Safehouse became a very elaborate solution to a problem that might never materialize. So the problem was made to materialize. In the leaked treatment of a canceled 1998 Fallout film, there was an early version of this idea: a Vault Company executive who fires the first nuclear weapon to fulfill his own prophecy. That film was never made, and that script was never canon. But the television series picked up the thread and wove it into something the games can no longer ignore. What makes this devastating is the scale of the cynicism involved. If China fired first, the war was the result of two superpowers who had backed each other into corners and ran out of diplomatic road. That is a tragedy. People made terrible decisions under terrible pressure, and the world paid for it. But if Vault-Tec fired first, if a private corporation decided that the most profitable thing it could do was end civilization, then the Great War is not a tragedy. It is a transaction. The vaults were not just survival shelters in that reading. They were the product Vault-Tec was selling, and the war was the marketing campaign. And this connects to something the games had always shown you without fully spelling out. The Vault experiments were never really about survival. They were research projects. Human subjects sealed underground, subjected to increasingly cruel conditions, and observed by an overseer with a clipboard and a corporate mandate to generate data. The vaults were laboratories, the residents were specimens, and the bombs were what started the experiment. There is a terminal entry in Fallout 4, part of the Switchboard location, which was a Defense Intelligence Agency facility that traces the chain of events on the morning of October 23rd. A squadron of Chinese aircraft, a first missile impact, a retaliatory strike ordered within minutes. The entire sequence of nuclear exchanges compressed into a few hours. The document reads like a log from the end of the world, because that is exactly what it is. 9:13 a.m. First contact on the detection network. What the log cannot tell you is who pulled the trigger before that detection happened. What launched before any alarm went off. What started the chain that started the chain? There is a theory, quiet but persistent in the fan community, that the very speed of the exchange, the fact that the entire nuclear war happened in a single day, suggests something beyond normal military escalation. Conventional nuclear warfare doctrine, even in Fallout's alternate 1950s aesthetic timeline, involved long periods of strategic calculation. The idea that both the US and China would exhaust their entire arsenals in a matter of hours implies something that short-circuited that process. A first strike that left no room for de-escalation. A calculation that this was already over before it began. Vault-Tec, if the television series is correct, would not have needed a large first strike. They would have needed only enough to make sure the response was automatic. To put enough missiles in the air that every early warning system on the planet screamed at once, and every nuclear-armed nation decided in the space of seconds that waiting was the same as dying. One bomb, if it landed in the right place, at the right moment, on the right target, could start a sequence that would burn the world. The overseer of Vault-33 in the television series sits at a table with Vault-Tec executives and hears them discuss this. She does not react with horror. She reacts with the slightly nauseated recognition of someone who has already suspected the worst about the institution she works for. That reaction feels true to the Fallout world. The horror is never the revelation itself. It is realizing that some part of you already knew. There is still no single clean answer to who started the Great War. The games have always left that space deliberately vague, and even with the television series adding weight to the Vault-Tec theory, the franchise seems unlikely to ever pin a single individual's name to the moment the first warhead left the launch tube. Some mysteries are kept open because closure would be too small. The Great War in Fallout works best as a wound without a single author. A catastrophe that accumulated over decades, grew from greed and fear, and the refusal to treat other human beings as fully real, and eventually became inevitable. But Captain Zhao is still out there in his submarine. He launched those missiles. He was following orders from a chain of command that no longer exists. And whatever started before him, whatever unseen hand initiated the sequence that gave him his orders, he is the one who has had to live with it. 200 years in a rusted metal tube, off the coast of a city his weapons helped destroy. Fallout's Great War is not a mystery about facts. It is a mystery about responsibility. And the deeper you look into it, the more clearly you see that responsibility was something the pre-war world was specifically designed to make impossible to trace. That was, perhaps, the whole point. If you are watching this from somewhere in the world right now, whether it is late at night, early morning, or somewhere in between, drop a comment and tell me where you are and what time it is. And if the Fallout lore is your kind of rabbit hole, make sure you are subscribed. There is a lot more of this ahead. Section 2. The Vault Experiments. What Vault-Tec was really doing underground. The first thing you need to understand about the vaults is that most of them were never designed to save anyone. That sounds like hyperbole. It is not. Tim Kaine, in interviews over the years, has been forthcoming about the evolution of the vault concept in the game's development. The original Fallout gave you Vault 13, your home, and Vault 15, the ruins of a neighboring shelter. Both were presented as relatively straightforward survival structures. The experiment angle came later, introduced in Fallout 2, when the writers realized that the vaults needed a reason to exist beyond simple nuclear shelter, a narrative purpose that could explain why so many of them had failed in such interesting ways. The explanation they landed on was that the vaults were never primarily survival shelters at all. They were research projects. The official government program was called Project Safehouse, and it was publicly sold as exactly what the name suggests, a nationwide network of underground facilities that would preserve a portion of the American population in the event of nuclear war. Citizens purchased spaces in the vaults. They signed documents. They believed they were buying their families a future. What the documents did not disclose was that Vault-Tec had a secondary purpose for every facility it built. Each vault was an experiment. The residents were the subjects. And the data Vault-Tec was collecting behavioral data, physiological data, psychological stress responses, social collapse timelines was intended for purposes that had nothing to do with rebuilding civilization. The prevailing theory among Fallout scholars and deeply invested fans is that the Vault data was designed for something like interstellar colonization or long-duration space travel. How do human populations behave when confined to closed environments for extended periods? What social structures emerge under extreme scarcity? How do people distribute resources and power when there is no outside world to appeal to? These are exactly the questions you would need to answer before you sent a generation ship into deep space. Whether that was the true purpose of the experiments, or whether Vault-Tec executives were simply running the largest and most comprehensive study of human cruelty ever conceived for reasons of pure academic interest is, like so much in Fallout, left deliberately ambiguous. What is not ambiguous is the nature of the experiments themselves. Vault 11, located in the Mojave Desert near New Vegas, was given instructions that told its residents they must sacrifice one of their number every year. The vault's automated systems informed the population that failure to produce a sacrifice would result in the termination of all vault residents by unknown means. The community built an entire political philosophy around this requirement. They formed factions, they created a system for deciding who would be chosen, they held votes, they had civil wars. The society inside Vault 11 became a perfect, compressed model of how civilizations negotiate the distribution of suffering, who bears the cost of collective survival, how power accretes to those willing to enforce that cost on others, and what happens to a community's moral foundations when survival is structured around the routine sacrifice of the innocent. It went on for years. When the surviving population finally reached 5 members and collectively refused to continue when they looked at each other and said, in effect, that they would rather die than choose again. The Vault's automated response system delivered a message that is one of the most devastating moments in any of the games. The system told them that sacrifice had never actually been required. It was never necessary. The threat was a lie. The entire structure of their society, every sacrifice they had made, every person they had chosen, every civil war they had fought, had been built on a false premise. And the system congratulated the 5 survivors as shining examples of humanity. The cruelty of that message is architectural. The system was not malfunctioning. It was doing exactly what it was designed to do, testing whether a community would eventually reject the logic of mandatory sacrifice, and at what cost. The fact that by the time they passed the test, most of the vault was dead, was presumably noted in the data. Vault 12, just south of Vault 11's region in the lore, was designed to study the effects of radiation on a confined population. The vault door was programmed never to fully seal. Radiation flooded the interior from the beginning. The population did not know this was intentional. They thought their shelter was defective. Many of them became ghouls, the radiation-transformed humans who populate much of the Fallout wasteland, aged and altered by exposure, but capable of surviving doses that would kill an unmodified person several times over. The city of Necropolis, which you encounter in the original Fallout, was founded by the ghoul survivors of Vault 12, an entire civilization grown from a deliberate act of corporate betrayal. Vault 77 exists only in a webcomic that Bethesda released around the time of Fallout 3, which technically gives it a complicated canonical status, but the premise is worth noting. 1 man and a crate of hand puppets. The Vault's experiment was isolation of a single resident with an enormous supply of puppets, the results of which were documented through the increasingly fractured perspective of someone who slowly had conversations with those puppets that became, over time, more real to him than his own solitude. Vault 92, encountered in Fallout 3 as a ruined facility in the capital wasteland, was stocked entirely with musicians. White noise generators were installed in the sleeping quarters, designed to broadcast subliminal audio that steadily increased aggressive tendencies in the population. The experiment was measuring the effects of prolonged subliminal suggestion on creative individuals under confined conditions. The result was a massacre. The population turned on each other before anyone fully understood why they were angrier every day. The journal entries you find in Vault 92's terminals document that descent in precise and unbearable detail. A community of artists who came to shelter with their instruments, their notebooks, their recordings, and who died, covered in each other's blood in the corridors of a place that was designed to drive them to it. Vault 101, where the player character of Fallout 3 is born and raised, had an experiment that was almost elegant in its simplicity. The vault was designed never to open. Not until the experiment concluded, not until an outside authority declared the purpose fulfilled never. The residents of Vault 101 were meant to believe, permanently and sincerely, that the outside world was inaccessible. The Overseer's function was to maintain that belief against all evidence to the contrary. Your father James broke that seal when he left the vault to pursue his work on Project Purity. His departure was not just a personal decision, it was an act of sabotage against Vault-Tec's experiment, and it is the reason you spend the rest of Fallout 3 navigating the consequences. The Overseer of Vault 101 was not simply authoritarian out of personal temperament. The position was structurally required to be authoritarian. Vault-Tec had designed a social environment where the Overseer's primary mandate was to prevent the experiment from being contaminated by contact with the outside world. Any resident who discovered the truth that the wasteland was survivable, that other communities existed, that life continued beyond the sealed door, was a threat to the data, and the Overseer's response to your father's departure, and later to your own return, was shaped by that institutional imperative. This is one of the things Fallout does consistently well, across multiple entries and multiple development teams. The horror of the vaults is never just that bad things happened in them. The horror is that the bad things were policy. Vault 87, also in the capital Wasteland, was an FEV research facility. The residents were exposed to the forced evolutionary virus not as an accident, not as a contamination event, but as the Vault's stated purpose. Vault-Tec, in cooperation with the U.S. military's secret research division, used the Vault population as initial test subjects for the mutagenic program that would eventually produce the super mutants. The super mutants you encounter throughout the DC area in Fallout 3 are the descendants of that experiment, people who were sealed in what they believed was a shelter and instead became the raw material for a biological weapons program. Vault 22 inches, the Mojave was given to a group of scientists tasked with addressing post-apocalyptic food scarcity by developing agricultural systems that could function without traditional sunlight or water sources. The experiment was innovative, and the goal was genuinely constructive, which makes what happened there particularly sad. A fungal pathogen, developed as part of the Vault's experimental agricultural program, mutated in ways the scientists could not control. The infection spread through the air handling systems. The residents who survived the initial outbreak became hosts for a parasitic organism that turned them into something between human and plant. The Vault, when you explore it in New Vegas, is overgrown in a way that feels almost peaceful until you remember that every piece of that growth was once a person. Vault 34 inches, the Mojave had its own particular grimness. The experiment required the Vault to be stocked with an excess of weapons and ammunition relative to its population, with no overseer initially appointed. The designers wanted to observe what a fully armed community would do when placed under the stresses of Vault life. The answer, documented through the terminals you find in the ruined facility, was that they did almost exactly what you would expect, which does not make it any less awful to read about. What unifies all of these experiments is the same quality that makes them so disturbing to sit with: the precision of the cruelty. These were not accidents. They were hypotheses. Each vault was a controlled variable in a larger experiment. The suffering was the methodology. There is a detail in Fallout 4 that tends to get lost in the game's main narrative, but it lingers. The Vault-Tec rep who appears at your door in the prologue, the cheerful, slightly desperate salesman who informs you that your family has been pre-selected for residency in Vault 111, survives the war as a ghoul. You can find him 200 years later in Goodneighbor, still wearing the remnants of his company uniform, still processing the fact that the company he worked for was directly complicit in the end of the world. He sells you information. He is, in some sense, still working for Vault-Tec, because Vault-Tec is the only identity he has left. That is Fallout's darkest joke about corporate loyalty. The company destroyed the world, and the salesman is still on the clock. The vaults were not shelters. They were a product, something to be sold to frightened people who did not read the fine print. And the experiment within each vault was Vault-Tec's true deliverable, the thing the company was actually building toward, long before the bombs ever fell. The real experiment, some fans have argued, was not any individual vault's specific protocol. The real experiment was whether human beings, given the choice between a terrifying but authentic world and a controlled, comfortable cage, would choose the cage, and then whether they would fight to stay in it, even after someone proved the door was unlocked all along. Section 3, The Mysterious Stranger. An enigma that defies the rules of the world. There is a character who has appeared in every mainline Fallout game since the original 1997 release, and after nearly 30 years, nobody can tell you who he is. He has no real name. He has no backstory that any game will confirm. He shows up during combat, fires a single shot from a large-caliber revolver with enough precision to change the outcome of the fight, and then he disappears before anyone can ask him a single question. He wears a beige trench coat and a wide-brimmed fedora. He carries a .44 Magnum with a faint guitar chord that plays whenever the weapon is drawn or holstered. His appearance shifts slightly between games. In Fallout 3 and New Vegas, he is younger. In Fallout 4, he is middle-aged with a mustache, which has fueled speculation that there may be more than one of him, or that the mysterious stranger ages but does not die, or that the person in the trench coat is a role rather than an individual. In Fallout, New Vegas. There is a character called the Lonesome Drifter camped north of El Dorado Gas and Service. He is a solitary musician, a quiet man who plays guitar in the desert and does not say much about his past. When you talk to him, he mentions, almost in passing, that his father was a mysterious man, a stranger to his own family. He does not know who his father was, only that the man left behind a single memento, a unique .44 Magnum that the Drifter calls the Mysterious Magnum. When you draw the weapon, the same guitar notes that announce the mysterious stranger play. When you holster it, a chord resolves, as if the song that has followed this revolver across 2 centuries of wasteland is finally, briefly concluding. The game never explicitly states the connection. It presents the evidence and steps back. But the implication is clear enough. The mysterious stranger had a child at some point in the decades between the Great War and New Vegas's 2281 setting. He had a life, however interrupted or unexplained. He left someone behind. What makes this detail stranger is the timeline. The mysterious stranger appears in the original Fallout, set in 2161. He appears in Fallout 2, set in 2241. He appears in Fallout 3, set in 2277. He is present in New Vegas in 2281 and in Fallout 4 inches 2287. If the Lonesome Drifter is his son, then the stranger fathered a child sometime between 2161 and 2281. But the stranger himself does not appear to have aged consistently across that span, and when Nick Valentine in Fallout 4 investigates the stranger's appearances, the detective robot finds no record of how the man has managed to be active across the entirety of the post-war era without leaving a paper trail, without aging into decrepitude, without apparently dying once. Nick Valentine maintains a case file on the mysterious stranger. He keeps it under his bed in his office in Diamond City, along with his case notes and his spare parts. The file essentially documents what any careful observer of the stranger would note. No consistent identity, no traceable origin, no explanation for the apparent immortality, and appearances dating back to the earliest days of the wasteland. Valentine finds the stranger genuinely unsettling, which is worth noting because Valentine is a machine who has encountered most of the Commonwealth's horrors without flinching. Whatever the stranger represents to Nick Valentine's pattern recognition systems, it is not something he can easily categorize. The lore around the stranger's design origin points toward an intentional cultural reference. His appearance is drawn from film noir aesthetics, the trench coat, the fedora, the revolver, the guitar motif that sounds like something from a spaghetti western. The creative team at Interplay was pulling from the visual vocabulary of 1950s crime films and American folk legend. The archetype of the stranger who rides in, saves the day, and rides out before anyone can ask his name. That archetype is embedded in American storytelling so deeply that it predates cinema. It is in dime novels and folk ballads. The idea that the wasteland, literal or figurative, sometimes produces a figure who operates outside ordinary accountability. There is also a literary reference that is frequently cited in discussions of the stranger's origins. Mark Twain wrote an unfinished novel called The Mysterious Stranger, in which the title character is identified as Satan's nephew, a being of supernatural origin who appears among ordinary people, demonstrates his power, and then vanishes without obligation. Twain's Mysterious Stranger carries a 44 inches some versions of the text. He uses it. He is not evil, exactly, but he is not subject to the constraints that govern human morality. He exists outside of consequence. That framing maps onto the Fallout mysterious stranger in interesting ways. The game mechanics make him literally appear and vanish in the middle of VAT sequences, materializing from nothing and disappearing just as completely. In Fallout 3, the description in the official game guide refers to him as having a guardian angel, but with a deadly hand cannon instead of wings. The supernatural framing is there from the beginning. In Fallout 4, Nora or Nate, the player characters, cannot interact with the stranger after he appears, but companions can. Companions react to his presence, and Nick Valentine's reaction is the most telling. He recognizes the stranger from his own fragmented pre-war memories that come from the original Nick Valentine, the human detective whose mind was used as the template for the synth. The original Nick Valentine, who lived before the Great War. Which means if those memories are accurate, the mysterious stranger was already active before the bombs fell. Before the bombs fell. If the stranger has been operating in the wasteland since before the Great War, if he was already out there in pre-war America, helping people in desperate combat situations in the same way he helps you now, then whatever he is, he predates the world that created every other character in the franchise. He is not a product of the wasteland. He is something older than the wasteland, that simply remained when everything else changed. Some fan theories position the stranger as a kind of observer or enforcer from outside the normal Fallout universe, something like the entity described in Twain's novel, a being with access to the mechanisms of the world that ordinary characters cannot perceive. The fact that he only appears when a specific perk has been taken, and that his appearance probability scales with the luck attribute, suggests an in-universe explanation. Perhaps extremely lucky individuals exist in a state that makes them visible to whatever the stranger is watching for. Perhaps luck in the Fallout world is not random chance, but something closer to the attention of the universe, and certain people, wanderers, survivors, pivotal figures in the Wasteland's ongoing story attract a kind of notice that manifests as a man in a trench coat with perfect aim. That interpretation is speculative, deliberately so. The mysterious stranger is constructed to resist definitive answers. But what remains after you account for all the speculation is something worth sitting with. In a universe where nothing survives for long, where the wasteland grinds people down into ghouls or corpses or something they wouldn't recognize as themselves, there is a man in a beige coat who has been quietly doing something for over 200 years, without explanation, without deterioration, without anyone ever getting close enough to ask him why. He fires his weapon. The guitar chord plays. He is gone before the echo fades. There is a version of the mysterious stranger theory that suggests the man is not one person but many, that the role is inherited, that the coat and the fedora and the revolver pass from one bearer to the next, and that each new stranger carries the weight of everyone who wore it before. This would explain the aging discrepancy between games, the slight physical differences, and the fact that the lonesome drifter exists as a son without apparently inheriting the role. In that version, the mysterious stranger is a legacy rather than an individual, a chain of people who chose to step into the role of the wasteland's silent guardian, who took the coat from whoever preceded them and went back into the desert to keep watch over people who did not know they were being watched. That reading is perhaps the most human explanation available, which may be exactly why the games have never confirmed it. The mysterious stranger is more interesting as a question than as an answer. His value to the Fallout universe is precisely his incompleteness, the sense that somewhere out there, beyond the edges of the map, in some part of the wasteland you never quite reached, there is something operating according to rules you were never given access to. He is the thing that watches the watchers, the help that arrives without being asked, the shot that saves your life from a distance that should have been too far for any normal person to fire accurately. The guitar plays, he vanishes. The enemy falls. You never found out where he went. Section 4 Mr. House. The closest thing to a god the wasteland ever produced. Robert Edwin House was born in 2020, making him 57 years old when the bombs fell, and he is the most powerful human being in the post-war world who is unambiguously still human. That distinction matters. The Fallout universe has plenty of individuals who have extended their lifespans through technology. Nick Valentine is a synthetic mind in a mechanical body. The Enclave's leadership depends on cybernetic enhancement. Various ghouls have survived centuries through radiation adaptation, but House is something different. He is a man who looked at the end of the world coming and decided, with the same calm analytical precision he applied to everything else, that he was too valuable to die in it. His plan was not survivable by ordinary standards. By 2077, House had retreated into the Lucky 38 casino on the Las Vegas Strip. He had disconnected himself from direct physical engagement with the world, placing himself in a life support system so sophisticated that it could maintain his biological functions indefinitely, while he managed everything else through an extended network of automated systems. He had essentially become part of the casino, a human brain running a building, running a network, running a city. The catch was the platinum chip. House had designed and ordered a specialized computer chip that would allow him to upgrade the Securitron robot army he had positioned throughout Vegas, activating them from standby mode into full combat capacity deploying the missile defense systems of the Lucky 38 to intercept incoming warheads, and completing the network integration that would make him fully operational as a city administrator rather than just a life support patient. The chip was being manufactured in Sunnyvale, California. It was scheduled for delivery on the 23rd of October 2077. The courier carrying it was, presumably, making good time. The bombs fell at 9:13 a.m. House calculated the date of the nuclear exchange to within a small window. He was close. He was days from being fully prepared. The platinum chip arrived 200 years later, carried by a courier who had been shot in the head and left for dead in a shallow grave outside Goodsprings, and delivered to House only after the courier had already navigated their way through half of the Mojave. That gap, those missing hours between when the chip should have arrived and when the bombs actually fell, is the pivot point of everything in Fallout New Vegas. It is the reason House was forced to deploy his missile defense network with degraded systems, intercepting most but not all of the warheads aimed at Vegas and the surrounding area. It is why the New Vegas Strip is largely intact while most of the Mojave is not. House's plan worked, but imperfectly, and the imperfection cost him 2 centuries of reduced capability. What makes House compelling as a character and deeply unsettling as a figure is the internal consistency of his worldview. He is not deluded. He is not self-aggrandizing in the way that post-apocalyptic warlords usually are. He does not believe he is saving humanity in the abstract. He believes he is the single most qualified individual currently alive to make decisions about humanity's future, and he has evidence to support that belief. Before the war, House was the CEO of Robco Industries. The Pip-Boy you carry throughout every Fallout game is a Robco product. So are the Protectron security robots, the Mister, handy domestic assistants, the computer terminals that still run on 200-year-old power in every building you explore. Robco was the pre-war world's most dominant technology company, and House built it from almost nothing through a combination of intelligence, work, and a willingness to make decisions that other people found too uncomfortable to make. He was not a good person in the conventional sense. His path to the top of Robco involved legal battles, leveraged acquisitions, and the kind of ruthless elimination of competition that people describe charitably as disruptive and uncharitably as predatory. But the products he built actually worked, and they worked for 200 years past the point when their creator expected them to need maintenance. There is a grudging argument to be made that a man who builds infrastructure that outlasts civilization by 2 centuries understood something about durability that most of his contemporaries did not. By 2281, when the courier arrives in the Mojave House, has spent 200 years maintaining the Vegas Strip through his Securitron network and the 3 families, the Chairmen, the Omertas, and the White Glove Society who manage the 3 casinos that remain operational. His negotiations with these gangs, in the absence of any functioning government, involved essentially buying their loyalty with territory and legitimacy. It is the logic of a feudal lord, which is perhaps appropriate for a man who exists in something close to a tower, surrounded by automated soldiers. The new California Republic, the closest thing Fallout's world has to a functioning democratic state, is expanding east toward Vegas. Caesar's Legion is expanding west. Both want the Hoover Dam, which is the Mojave's single most significant source of power infrastructure. House wants the dam too, but for different reasons. House does not want to incorporate Vegas into a larger nation-state. He wants to use it as the nucleus of something new, a civilization built on his principles, rather than the principles of either the NCR's bureaucratic democracy or the Legion's slave culture authoritarianism. When you ask House what he envisions for humanity's future, he describes space colonization. In a few hundred years, his plan goes, the Vegas economy generates enough surplus capital to fund an industrial base capable of building starships. Humanity breaks free of a planet that has been rendered largely uninhabitable, and the species that survived the Great War becomes the species that reaches other worlds. It is, possibly, the most grandiose plan in any video game. It is also, given what we know about House's track record, not entirely implausible. He built Robco from a startup into the world's dominant technology company. He predicted the nuclear exchange to within a small window. His infrastructure is still running 2 centuries after maintenance became impossible for anyone else. He is not a man who underachieves against his own projections. The mystery that surrounds House is less about his identity, he is transparent about who he was, and more about whether he is right. The player, as the courier, can choose to work with House, to destroy him and hand Vegas to the NCR, to hand Vegas to Caesar's Legion, or to take control for themselves through the rogue Securitron Yes Man. Each ending carries consequences that the game explores in some depth. The NCR ending results in Vegas being absorbed into an organization that is already struggling under its own administrative weight. The Legion ending replaces one dictatorial structure with another, significantly more violent one. The Yes Man ending leaves the courier in charge of a city-state without the institutional depth to sustain it long-term. Only the House ending has a clear articulation of a long-term plan, which is not the same as the House ending being the right choice. House is categorically unwilling to share power. He treats people as resources, manages the three families with the same operational logic he applies to Securitron maintenance, and has demonstrated throughout his 200-year tenure that his definition of human welfare is more or less identical to his definition of what is good for the House plan. He is not cruel for its own sake, but he is also not particularly interested in individual suffering as a category distinct from systemic inefficiency. There is a detail in Fallout, New Vegas, that tends to sink in slowly. The Platinum chip was manufactured in Sunnyvale, California. The date on the chip, inscribed in tiny characters on its reverse side, includes a reference to the 23rd of October, 2077, the day of the Great War. House ordered the chip to be delivered that specific day because that was when he needed it. His missile defense deployment was timed to the war's commencement. He was not trying to stop the bombs. He was trying to protect a specific patch of Nevada real estate while the rest of the world burned. That framing changes the moral weight of his plan somewhat. House was not a man trying to save humanity from the Great War. He was a man trying to use the Great War as a controlled demolition to clear away the existing civilizational structure and survive long enough on his protected island to build something new from the ruins. The question of whether that constitutes heroism or opportunism is one the game is smart enough to leave open. House would say the distinction is irrelevant. What matters is outcome. What matters is that Vegas survived, and that the Mojave has 200 years of comparative stability to show for it, and that when the rest of the world was burning, someone had a plan. He is not entirely wrong about any of that. He is also not entirely trustworthy, and his willingness to eliminate anyone who gets too close to his plans, including, depending on your choices, the courier suggests that his confidence in his own judgment is total in a way that does not accommodate other perspectives. There is something of the pre-war world's pathology in that. The same unshakable belief in the righteousness of one's own judgment that drove the resource wars, the FEV experiments, the Vault program it lives in House 2, refined to its most rational-seeming expression. He is the most capable human in the wasteland, and the most capable human in the wasteland was shaped by the same civilization that ended the world. That civilization is his reference point for what civilization should look like. He cannot see outside it any more than anyone else can. The Lucky 38's lights are still on. In a world of darkness and ruin, that counts for something. Whether it counts for enough is the question Fallout. New Vegas never answers, because it is the question the player has to answer for themselves. Section 5, The Courier's Lost Past. What happened before Goodsprings? You were shot twice in the head at point-blank range. You were buried alive in a shallow grave. A robot dug you up. You were carried to a doctor in a town you may have never visited before, and when you woke up, the first thing you did was walk out into the Mojave and start recovering the package you were paid to deliver. That sequence of events is, in many ways, the entire character summary for the courier. Not the shooting and the burial, those are just the prologue. The character summary is what comes after, the getting up, the continuing anyway. The courier in Fallout. New Vegas is one of the most deliberately incomplete protagonists in modern RPG history. The design philosophy at Obsidian Entertainment was explicit about this. The game gives you almost no confirmed backstory. You can ask characters about the NCR as though you have never heard of them, even though the NCR is effectively the government of the region you grew up in. You can respond to Cass's description of the Long 15 with apparent unfamiliarity. The dialogue options are built to accommodate a courier who might be anything: a former NCR soldier, a tribal, a caravan worker, someone born in the wasteland without the anchors of faction or community. The one thing the Lonesome Road DLC adds to the courier's history is specific and strange and troubling. and it is delivered by Ulysses, a former legionary turned wanderer who has been waiting in the ruins of the Divide for the chance to finally meet the person who destroyed it. The Divide was a settlement, not large, not wealthy, but functional, a community that had grown up along a stretch of old highway in the Mojave, sustained by the courier route that passed through it. Ulysses found the Divide and saw something in it that he had not expected to see in the wasteland: the possibility of a home. A place that was not defined by the factions that wanted to consume it. A place where something new could grow. Then a courier arrived with a package. The package contained a pre-war device, a detonation signal of some kind, the exact nature of which Ulysses never quite explains in terms that allow full understanding of the mechanism. The device activated dormant nuclear warheads that had been buried in the area since before the Great War. The Divide was destroyed in minutes. Ulysses survived. The courier left with no apparent awareness of what they had caused. That courier was you. The mystery of the courier's forgotten past is precisely that forgetting. You delivered a package to the Divide. The Divide was destroyed. At some point between then and the events of New Vegas, the courier either forgot what happened or processed the memory in a way that did not register as significant. The game offers multiple in-universe explanations. The courier was shot in the head by Benny head trauma can produce retrograde amnesia. The explosion at the Divide itself might have been traumatic enough to create dissociation. Some of the dialogue hints that the courier may simply not have known what was in the package, may have been delivering a sealed container with instructions not to open it, following the professional ethics of a courier who does not ask what is in the box. Ulysses cannot accept any of these explanations, not because they are implausible, but because they do not satisfy his need for the courier to have intended the destruction. He has spent years constructing a narrative in which the courier is a kind of symbol, not a person, really, but the embodiment of the wasteland's capacity for damage. The roads that connect communities also carry the packages that destroy them. The same system of movement and exchange that allows civilizations to function is the system that delivered a weapon to the Divide. He is not wrong about the system. He is possibly wrong about the courier. The tension of Lonesome Road is built around the question of whether you carry responsibility for what you did not know you were carrying. This is not a simple question. It is the same question the Great War raises about every soldier who followed orders, every scientist who contributed a component to a weapon without full knowledge of what it would do, every ordinary citizen who paid taxes to a government conducting programs they never asked about. The chain of causation is real. The distance from intention is also real. What the Lonesome Road does not give you is absolution. Regardless of which side you choose in the final confrontation with Ulysses, regardless of whether you launch the warheads or stop them, talk Ulysses down or fight him to the end, the game ends with the courier walking out of the Divide, having looked directly at the thing they caused and made a choice about what to do with that knowledge. That moment, that specifically post-Lonesome Road courier, is the most fully realized version of the character. Not the person who woke up in Doc Mitchell's bed at the beginning of the game, not quite knowing where they were going. The person who walked out of the Divide knowing exactly what they had done and deciding to keep going anyway. There is a reading of the courier's backstory that the game does not confirm, but also does not foreclose. The courier who arrived in the Divide was not necessarily the same person who left it. Not literally same body, same hands, same professional reputation in the courier business, but there is a version of the pre-New Vegas courier who knew things, who had relationships, who had context for the Mojave, that the opening dialogue options suggest they do not have anymore. Something happened between the Divide and Goodsprings that does not fully resolve. The bullet in the head is one explanation. The game accepts it and moves on. But the Lonesome Road exists precisely because the bullet does not explain everything. Ulysses is waiting at the end of a road the game built specifically to make you ask whether you really understand who you were before the story began. The answer is that you do not know. The courier does not know. That uncertainty is the design. It is also, in a certain light, the most honest thing any Fallout game has ever done about its own player character. Every RPG protagonist begins as an almost empty vessel for the player to pour themselves into. New Vegas acknowledges that container more directly than most. You are a courier. You go where you are sent. You carry what you are given. What you do with what you know when you arrive, that is the only definition of character the game considers definitive. The rest is what happened before the story started. And before the story started, you were someone. That person is mostly gone now, buried in the divide under years of sand and memory and at least one bullet. You are what came after them, walking the same road, carrying new packages, hoping they contain what the shipping manifest says they do. Section 6, Dunwich. Something ancient beneath the wasteland. The Dunwich building in Fallout 3 is not a difficult location to find. It sits in the southwestern quadrant of the capital wasteland, a large, brutalist office complex surrounded by feral ghouls and accessible through a front door that opens without resistance. Most players walk in expecting another scavenge run, ammunition, caps, medical supplies, maybe a terminal worth reading for background texture. What they find instead is something that does not fit the game's established logic. The building is wrong in ways that are hard to articulate at first. The ghouls are more densely packed than most locations of similar size. The architecture is standard mid-century commercial construction until you get to the lower floors, where something else begins to emerge. The walls start showing carved stone, not construction materials carved stone, with symbols that predate the Great War by enough of a margin to be legitimately inexplicable. In a world where everything is defined by the catastrophe of 2077, these carvings exist in a time frame that has nothing to do with nuclear weapons or corporate malfeasance or government overreach. The Dunwich building is the first appearance of something the Fallout series would return to repeatedly in subsequent entries. A sustained reference to Lovecraftian horror. H.P. Lovecraft, the early 20th century American author whose fiction introduced the concept of cosmic horror, the idea that the universe contains forces so vast and alien that human comprehension of them is inherently destructive, becomes an unexpected presence in the Fallout universe. Not as an Easter egg or a throwaway reference, but as a genuine structural element of a specific location's lore. The Dunwich Corporation, the company whose building you are exploring, appears in the Fallout universe as a contracting firm that operated in the pre-war period. On its surface, it was a commercial construction and services company. Beneath that surface, the available evidence suggests the company's leadership was aware of something that existed under certain pieces of real estate. They acquired something that had been there long before the United States existed, possibly long before any civilization that left written records existed, and they were systematically digging down to get to it. An obelisk found in Fallout 3's Dunwich building connects to the broader mystery. The artifact, a large stone pillar covered in carvings that do not correspond to any pre-war architectural tradition, appears to have an effect on people in its proximity, inducing visions or hallucinations of a quality that feels, to anyone experiencing them, less like a breakdown and more like a window into something genuine. Fallout 4 returns to this lore through the Dunwich Borers, a marble quarry in the Commonwealth that was operated by the same company. The quarry is deeper than it needs to be for marble extraction. The drilling went further than any reasonable commercial calculation would justify. The journal entries from the quarry's management are a slow disclosure of what they were actually looking for following the carvings as they went down, following the sense of something that grew stronger as they descended, until they reached a level where the stone gave way to something that was clearly not natural and clearly not made by anyone in the contemporary era. At the quarry's lowest level, past a series of flashback sequences that show pre-war workers having experiences that the game renders as visions, glimpses of a world before the one you know, a world in which things that are not human were present and active. There is a chamber. In the chamber is an altar. On the altar is a knife called Cremvier's Tooth, one of the most powerful melee weapons in Fallout 4, described in its lore as a sacrificial blade. The altar is surrounded by carved stone pillars, ancient symbols etched into rock that has not seen sunlight in geological time. And beneath the water in the chamber, staring upward, is an eye. A vast stone eye, part of a carved face so large that you cannot fully see its dimensions from within the chamber. The game does not explain what the face belongs to. The scale alone tells you that it is not a human figure. The scale alone tells you that whatever was carved here was carved by people who were worshipping something they understood to be enormous. The Dunwich Corporation, the terminal entries confirm, knew the altar was there before they began the mining operation. The quarry was not a business decision. It was an excavation project with a specific destination, and that destination was a site of ancient ritual use, designed to access or contact or honor whatever the stone face in the water represents. In the lore surrounding the Dunwich sites, there are references to a name, Ug-Qualtoth. This entity, never described in complete detail anywhere in the games, appears to be connected to the visions that both the pre-war Dunwich workers and post-war visitors to these sites experience. The nature of those visions is consistent enough across multiple characters, recorded across multiple terminals, to suggest something external rather than simple psychological breakdown. The people who descend into these locations are seeing things that are not there by ordinary physics, and what they are seeing tends to converge on similar imagery: the altar, the darkness, the sense of something that has been waiting with patience that does not map onto human comprehension of time. Lorenzo Cabot, encountered in Fallout 4's Cabot House questline, is a pre-war archaeologist who spent decades studying an artifact of clearly ancient and non-human origin in the Middle East. His research is explicitly connected to the same network of occult archaeology that Dunwich represents. Lorenzo was institutionalized for most of the 20th century, partially because what he brought back from his expedition actually worked, in ways that drove him past any stability that other people could engage with. The serum he was able to produce from the artifact extended his family's lifespans dramatically. It also made Lorenzo increasingly hostile to the normal world, as if the extended exposure to whatever the artifact represented was rewriting his relationship to ordinary human experience. Both Lorenzo and the character of Pickman, a ghoul artist you can encounter in Fallout 4's back alleys of Boston, who creates paintings from blood and viscera that seem to document visions of something enormous and dark. Speak of whispers. They do not mean this metaphorically. They describe actual auditory experiences, voices that they cannot attribute to any identifiable source that seem to come from beneath the ground. Fallout almost never invokes the supernatural directly. The series is built on a specific scientific-ish framework: radiation, mutation, advanced robotics, the consequences of specific technologies applied without ethical restraint. The super mutants are the result of a virus. The ghouls are the result of radiation. The Brotherhood of Steel is the result of military culture without a war to fight. Everything has an explanation rooted in the pre-war world's decisions. Dunwich does not have that kind of explanation. The stone carvings predate the United States. The altar predates any civilization in North America that left physical records. The eye in the water is looking up at you from a geological layer that should contain nothing but rock and time. The games present this and step back. They do not resolve it. There is no quest that explains what Ug-Qualtoth is, where the stone face comes from, why the Dunwich Corporation was able to identify and access these sites, or what the visions mean. The mystery is complete and intentional, the same kind of deliberate incompleteness that Lovecraft himself used to create dread, because the thing you cannot fully see or name is always more frightening than the thing you can describe. But the persistent question for Fallout's larger lore is what this means for the universe's internal logic. If something ancient and non-human, and apparently still active, exists beneath the wasteland, if the horror in Dunwich is not metaphor, but documented, observable phenomenon, then the Great War was not the origin of every threat the world faces. The bombs did not create this. The bombs did not change it. Whatever is in Dunwich was there before the United States existed, will presumably be there long after the wasteland's current civilizations have burned out and been replaced, and appears to be patient in a way that makes human concepts of urgency feel trivially small. There is something almost restful in that, in a dark way. The universe is indifferent to the factions arguing over Hoover Dam. Whatever waits beneath the Dunwich borers has been waiting since before anyone in the Fallout world was born, and will be waiting after everyone currently alive has turned to dust. It is not interested in the NCR versus the Legion. It is not interested in what the Brotherhood of Steel does with its technology. It has its own rhythm, operating across spans of time that make the 200-year history of the wasteland seem like a brief interruption. The altar is still down there. The knife is still on it. The eye is still looking up. It was there before the bombs fell. It will be there after. Section 7, Vault 111, and the Sole Survivor. The truth of what was done to you. Vault 111 was never designed to save its residents. This is, by Vault-Tec standards, not especially unusual. Most vaults were not designed to save their residents in any honest sense. But Vault 111's specific betrayal has a particular quality of coldness to it that stands out even in the company's catalog of institutional cruelty. The stated experiment was cryogenics. The vault's purpose, as described in Vault-Tec internal documentation, was to observe the effects of extended suspended animation on a sample population. This was framed to the government as preparatory research for eventual deep space colonization, and understanding how human beings tolerate long-duration cryosleep was presented as a legitimate scientific objective with obvious strategic value. The vault was located in the hills north of what had been Concord, Massachusetts, in the region that Fallout 4 calls the Commonwealth. The population it recruited was drawn from the surrounding area middle-class families, mostly, the kind of people who had military service records or government connections that got them pre-selected for the Vault-Tec program. The sole survivor, your character, is one of these residents, along with their spouse and infant son, Sean. What the residents were not told is that the cryogenic pods were not designed to operate on a finite schedule. The pods were designed to run indefinitely, maintained by automated systems, while the residents remained frozen. The vault's overseers were not there to monitor an experiment and eventually wake the population. They were there to manage a frozen storage facility. The cryosleep disguised as decontamination pods, that specific detail is worth dwelling on. When you watch the pre-war sequence at the beginning of Fallout 4, the vault door opens and the technicians are friendly and reassuring. They guide you and your spouse and your baby into what look like standing shower stalls and tell you to relax. The pods seal. The gas flows. Within a minute, you are frozen. You did not consent to indefinite cryostorage. You did not consent to any of it, because the informed consent document you signed to enter Vault 111 did not describe what was actually going to happen to you. You signed a document that sold you a shelter. You received a freezer. In 2227, 150 years into your sleep, the pod was opened briefly. Not yours, your spouse's. Two people entered the vault. A man you learn later was Conrad Kellogg, and at least one other. They were from the Institute, the secretive scientific organization operating out of the ruins of MIT in the Commonwealth. They were there for Sean. Sean was 60 years old at this point, having been taken as an infant from a cryogenic pod at an earlier date, or possibly, in a timeline the game makes deliberately confusing. He was taken as an infant, and the man who grew up to become the head of the Institute is your son, now decades older than you, despite being younger than you when you went to sleep. The game confirms this. Father, the leader of the Institute, is Sean. He is approximately 60 years old in 2287 when you finally meet him. He has spent his entire life inside the Institute. What the Institute wanted from the Vault population was pure pre-war DNA, uncontaminated by 2 centuries of post-war radiation exposure. Sean, taken as an infant before he had any significant radiation exposure, was the ideal candidate. His DNA became the template for the Institute's 3rd-generation synthetic humans, the Gen 3 synths, the artificial people who are indistinguishable from biological humans because they were built on a foundation of actual human genetic material. Every Gen 3 synth in the Commonwealth is, in some biological sense, derived from Sean, from your son, from a child who was taken from you while you slept. The sole survivor story is fundamentally about theft. The Vault stole your consent. The Institute stole your child. The 2 centuries of sleep stole everything else: your world, your context, your friends, your neighbors, the civilization that gave your life its shape. You wake up not into the world you left, but into its ruin, carrying a grief that the people around you cannot fully understand because none of them remember what was taken. And then you meet Father, an old man who is your infant son, and he tells you that what was done to you was necessary, that the synthesis of human and machine was the most important project in post-war history, that the discomfort of one family's disruption is a small price against the scale of what the Institute achieved. He says this with the calm certainty of a man who has never spent a single hour grieving what happened in Vault 111, because he never knew what was there to grieve. He was an infant when he was taken. The mother and father he never knew are abstractions to him. The tragedy happened in a room he was too young to remember. There is something worth sitting with in the irony of that distance. Sean spent his life building synthetic humans, people made from his own DNA, designed to be as human as possible. But the relationship he could not replicate was the one he never had access to. A parent who knew him before the world ended, who waited for him, who would recognize him on sight. The Institute's synthetic humans carry his genetic material. None of them carry the memory of being his. The mystery of Vault 111 that most players notice eventually is the question of why the rest of the Vault's residents died. The sole survivor wakes up as the only surviving human from a population of dozens. The other pods are occupied by corpses, people who went to sleep in 2077 and never woke up, who were frozen alive in a facility that was supposed to protect them. The Vault-Tec documentation pieced together from terminal entries gives a partial answer. The Vault's life support systems were manually deactivated in 2078, 1 year after the bombs fell. The security staff of the Vault, who were not frozen, had broken down into violence. Over the course of that first-year conflict between the Overseer and the security team over the Vault's operating protocols had escalated into a fatal confrontation. The Overseer was killed. The security team, left without direction and facing an indefinite underground existence, made a decision about the frozen residents that the game documents through their journal entries with painful specificity. They chose to leave. They turned off the life support for the pods they were not responsible for maintaining, leaving the frozen residents to eventually suffocate within their own pods, still frozen, still unaware, and they opened the vault door and walked out into the 2-week-old wasteland. Those security guards' fates are not known. They walked out into a world that was 14 days past nuclear apocalypse, with no plan, no supplies, and whatever moral weight they had chosen to carry. The vault they left behind contained a building full of frozen corpses and a single still-functioning pod, yours that the automated systems kept running because your pod had been specifically flagged by the Institute's advance team as a potential future retrieval target. You survived not because of luck. You survived because the Institute wanted to keep you available. Your continued cryosleep was their backup plan for the day when they needed a pre-war biological, a person from before the bombs, someone with the motivation and the capability to navigate the Commonwealth and potentially enter the Institute on their terms. Father designed his own rescue. He was 60 years old and dying of a terminal illness when you finally emerged from the vault, and he needed someone to take his place as the Institute's director. He wanted it to be you. He spent years as the most powerful person in post-war Massachusetts, running an organization with capabilities that exceeded anything else in the wasteland, and what he was doing, the part of his plan he would not have admitted even to himself in the early years, was building a world into which his parent could eventually wake and find a purpose. Whether that represents love or manipulation is a question Fallout 4 does not answer cleanly. Father is not a villain in the conventional sense. He is a man who was made by an institution that treated human beings as resources, who internalized that logic so completely that he applied it even to his own family relationships, who managed to build something genuinely impressive with tools that were morally appalling, and who is dying on a schedule that makes the ethical reckoning he might otherwise have had with his choices impossible. He runs out of time before he can be saved or condemned. You are left standing in the Institute with his authority and his decisions and the question of what you want to do with a civilization built on theft and synthetic people who do not know what they are. The cryopod is still in Vault 111. The other pods are still occupied. Whatever the security guards decided in 2078 is beyond any reckoning now. You are what survived it. The question is what you are going to do with that. Section 8 Strange Signals. The radio transmissions no one was supposed to hear. The wasteland has a sound, not the ambient noise of wind and distant gunfire and the occasional ghoul, something more specific. A frequency. The tinny, slightly distorted music that plays from the speakers of Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3, broadcasting from a fortified studio in the ruins of Washington, D.C., where Three Dog keeps the signal alive through what appears to be pure, stubborn charisma. But not all of the Pip-Boy's radio signals are music. Not all of them are human. And some of them were never meant to be heard by anyone currently alive. Three Dog is the voice of the capital wasteland, broadcasting news of the lone wanderer's exploits, playing pre-war music with the slightly manic energy of a man who knows the signal might go dark at any moment and has decided to treat that as a reason to be louder rather than quieter. Galaxy News Radio is one of the most beloved details in Fallout 3 precisely because it gives the desolation of the capital wasteland a voice, someone who is watching, noticing, keeping a record. But the radio frequencies that are worth dwelling on are the ones further down the dial. the ones that are not trying to be heard. The Recon Craft Theta Beacon is a radio signal broadcast from an alien ship that crash-landed in the capital wasteland. The signal range is limited about 5,000 meters, which means you have to be relatively close to the crash site to pick it up. When you do, what you hear is a looping transmission of what sounds like gibberish. Fragmented audio, bursts of static, sounds that do not quite resolve into language. The signal loops with the mechanical patience of an automated distress beacon, the kind of broadcast you set on automatic when you do not know if anyone is listening, designed to keep transmitting until someone comes to help. When players reversed and slowed down the transmission, they found a phrase embedded in the audio: "The alien is never alive." The voice delivering this message belongs to whatever automated system was running the alien ship, a system that has been broadcasting distress signal for the same 2 centuries that humanity has been sorting through the wreckage of its own catastrophe, with no one left to answer. The crash site, when you find it, has exactly one thing of value: the alien itself, dead. Whatever arrived here was already gone before anyone could respond. The ship is real. The beacon is real. The body is real. And the signal has been calling into the void since the crash. An automated goodbye from something that never knew anyone would eventually come looking. The capital wasteland also contains a signal called the People's Republic of America Radio, which broadcasts Chinese government propaganda from the pre-war era. The voice speaks in accented English, delivering upbeat messages about the inevitable victory of the Chinese people against American imperialism. The broadcast range is relatively wide, about 16,000 meters, meaning it covers a substantial portion of the map. The signal does not originate from China. It originates from somewhere in the capital wasteland itself, which raises questions. There are Chinese operatives in the region. Fallout 3 has random encounter events involving Chinese soldiers who are still active in some fashion, which connects to larger mysteries about what happened to Chinese forces that were on American soil when the bombs fell. The radio signal's origin and purpose become part of the same question. What was the Chinese military presence in the capital wasteland doing, and why is some piece of their infrastructure still broadcasting? One answer, consistent with available evidence, is that there was a Chinese stealth operation in the Washington area before the war intelligence gathering, possibly sabotage preparation, and that when the bombs fell, elements of that operation were still in place, still running their equipment, still following the last orders they received. 2 centuries later, the equipment is still running on whatever power source sustained it, and the message is still playing. Nobody is listening. Nobody on the Chinese side, anyway. The war they were fighting ended in nuclear fire before anyone could declare a winner or a loser. Fallout 3's Point Lookout expansion adds a location on the Maryland coast that generates its own atmospheric signals. The swamp environment of Point Lookout has a quality of sound that is distinct from the rest of the capital wasteland, quieter in some registers, stranger in others, with ambient audio that seems to shift between natural and something harder to categorize. There is a signal in Point Lookout that consists of what sounds like breathing and occasional moaning sounds, tracked back to a group of feral ghouls milling around a ham radio that is broadcasting whatever their presence happens to. Generate acoustically. The signal has no message. It is just the sound of people who were once people, circling a piece of equipment in a swamp. Their presence recorded and transmitted to anyone who happens to be tuned to the right frequency. The Morse code signals in Fallout 3 are perhaps the most useful of the unexplained transmissions, leading to underground shelters stocked with supplies, including at least one with a bobblehead collectible, and another with a passage that opens onto what was formerly used as a torture chamber. The signals themselves are human in origin. Someone set up broadcasting equipment and encoded coordinates before whatever happened to them happened. The messages are practical. They are not mysterious in the same way as the alien beacon or the Chinese propaganda loop. What they share with those other signals is the quality of speaking from a past that the present can no longer access. The person who encoded those Morse transmissions had specific things in mind when they placed their message in the frequencies. They wanted someone to find what they had hidden. They wanted to be useful past the moment of their own death. The signal is their way of still being here, still pointing at something valuable, still completing the action they started before they ran out of time to finish it. Old World Blues, the Fallout, New Vegas DLC set in Big MT, contains an entire network of signals and transmissions that carry their own weight of loss. The think tanks, the preserved brains of pre-war scientists, kept alive and mobile in robotic housings for 2 centuries, have been transmitting to each other and to the research installations throughout Big MT for the entire post-war period. What you walk into when you arrive in Big MT is not an abandoned facility. It is a still-running one, staffed by minds that have forgotten they are supposed to have stopped. Dr. Klein, the de facto leader of the think tanks, is brilliant and manic and has been conducting science with no ethical framework for 200 years in a sealed environment. He has become, as his colleague Mobius observes in a terminal entry, dangerous in the specific way that intelligence becomes dangerous when it loses its anchor in consequence. The think tanks ran experiments on the biological specimens they had access to, on themselves, on the environment, on each other. They are still running experiments. And they transmit everything: records, data, enthusiastic annotations across the Big MT network that you can access on any terminal in the facility. The signal that led you there in the first place, the one that summoned the courier to Big MT, was constructed by Mobius, the one think tank member who has enough self-awareness left to understand what has gone wrong in the facility. He manufactured the summons because he needed someone from outside, someone who still operated by the logic of consequence. Someone who had never stopped being a person and had therefore not yet become what the rest of the think tanks had become. In a wasteland full of transmissions that were broadcasting to no one, Mobius was the first in a long time to broadcast with the genuine intention of being understood. The Pip-Boy is a receiver, ultimately. It catches what is in the air. And the air of the Fallout wasteland is full of messages from people who are gone, distress calls and propaganda, and encrypted coordinates, and the sounds of people who were once human, breathing in a swamp beside a radio that cannot tell the difference between a message and the ambient noise of existing. All of it is still broadcasting. The transmitters do not know when to stop. Section 9. The Institute. What it really was and what it was really doing. Most of the factions in Fallout 4 are legible from a distance. The Brotherhood of Steel are military purists who believe technology should be controlled by people who understand how to control it. The Railroad are abolitionists who believe synthetic people have rights that should be protected. The Minutemen are a reconstructed militia trying to provide basic security to a region that lost it. The Institute is something else. The Institute operates behind a curtain of opacity so dense that by the time you finally teleport into their underground facility and see it clearly, the surprise is not that it is smaller than you feared. The surprise is that it is more ordinary than you feared. The Institute, located in an underground complex beneath the ruins of MIT in the Commonwealth, was founded by the university's survivors in the decades after the Great War. The early institute was genuinely trying to reconstruct civilization through scientific research, advancing medicine, engineering, agriculture, all the practical disciplines that a society needs to function. The mission drift that transformed it from a post-apocalyptic research institution into the terrifying shadow operation it became by 2287 happened gradually, through a series of decisions that each seemed locally defensible. The FEV research that the Institute conducted was a continuation of pre-war programs. The creation of super mutants, something the Institute was doing deliberately, seizing Commonwealth residents and subjecting them to the forced evolutionary virus, was not an accident. It was a research program. The Institute needed to understand what FEV did to human beings under controlled conditions, which meant they needed human beings to subject to it. They took those human beings from the surface world with no concern for the communities they were disrupting. The super mutant invasions that devastated settlements throughout the Commonwealth have an origin. They were the Institute's failed experiments, released into the wild when the subjects became too dangerous to maintain. The synth program began from a similar logic. The Institute wanted to create synthetic humans who could operate on the surface without detection, gathering intelligence, running operations, going places that Institute scientists could not go without protection from the Commonwealth's various dangers. The first-generation synths were robots, mechanical in appearance, easy to identify. The second generation were more sophisticated but still clearly artificial. The third generation, the ones built on Sean's DNA template, were indistinguishable from biological humans on any available testing measure. This is where the Institute's internal ethics failed most completely. The moment the Institute could create a person who could not be told apart from a natural-born human, they were no longer making tools. They were making people. And they were making those people without any of the rights or considerations that people require. The synths live in the Institute. Some of them work in the research divisions. Some of them are deployed to the surface as replacements swapping in where a human has been removed, living their life, never knowing what they are. The Railroad, the above-ground faction dedicated to synth liberation, exists because individual researchers inside the Institute found the ethics of this practice troubling enough to risk their lives to undermine it. The Institute's response to the synth's emergent humanity was administrative. The problem was categorized and assigned to a team. The Courser's specialized recovery units, made from synths themselves, were tasked with retrieving any synth that left the Institute without authorization. The logic used to justify the Corsair program was the same logic used to justify the synth program in general. These are assets, not people, and assets that go missing are assets that need to be recovered. The question that Fallout 4 builds toward in its Institute questline is whether the sole survivor can accept this logic long enough to become the Institute's director. Father, your son spent his life inside this institution. He genuinely believes the Institute represents humanity's best chance at long-term survival. The scientific work done underground in the Commonwealth has advanced medicine and engineering and agriculture past anything available on the surface. The synths are a means to an end. The surface world suffering is a temporary condition that the Institute will eventually alleviate when its research is complete. There is something recognizable in this reasoning. It is the same reasoning that Vault-Tec used to justify the Vault experiments. The suffering is real but finite. The knowledge is real and will outlast the suffering. The individuals who bear the cost of the project are not the project's intended beneficiaries, they are the material the project works with. This logic has a name. It is not a good name. The people who used it in history generally regretted it if they lived long enough to reckon with what they had done. The Institute under Father's leadership has been operating on this logic for decades. The surface world knows the Institute as a bogeyman, a source of unexplained disappearances and synthetic replacements, a fear that expresses itself in whispered stories about whether your neighbor is really your neighbor. The paranoia the Institute generates in the Commonwealth is not incidental to their operations. It is a byproduct, a side effect of working in secret with methods that cannot withstand scrutiny. What is lost in the fear and the mythology is the mundane reality of the Institute itself. Inside the complex, it is a research university. Scientists eat in a cafeteria. Children, the Gen 3 synths who were created as children, raised inside the facility, go to school. There are politics and gossip and professional rivalries between the departments. The horror of what the Institute does to the Commonwealth is enacted by people who then go home to functional living quarters and eat in the cafeteria and argue about resource allocation in department meetings. The banality is the point. The coursers who drag synths back to the Institute and the scientists who design the process by which human beings are replaced with synthetic duplicates and the administrators who approve operation plans involving the abduction of surface residents, these are people who have normal work, days. They have colleagues they like and colleagues they find difficult and institutional frustrations and career ambitions. They are not monsters. They are people who made a series of decisions that added up to something monstrous, and who live inside those decisions so completely that they cannot see them from outside. The Institute's central mystery is not what it is. By the time you walk its halls, you know what it is. The mystery is how it got there, how a group of survivors who genuinely wanted to rebuild civilization arrived 2 centuries later at an institution that disappears people and builds replacements and conducts experiments on unwilling subjects and calls all of this progress. The answer is incremental, one compromise at a time. One decision that seemed locally defensible but had downstream consequences nobody accounted for. The FEV research was justified by strategic necessity. The synth program was justified by operational needs. The replacement program was justified by intelligence requirements. Each step had a reason. The accumulation of reasons added up to something that, viewed whole, has no defense. Father believes he is on the right side of history. He is dying, and he wants his legacy preserved, and he wants the person he preserves it with to be family, the only family he ever had, preserved in ice for his entire lifetime, and now finally here. Whether that is love, or whether that is just another form of the Institute's characteristic belief that the end justifies whatever means are available, Is the question you carry with you when you leave the complex for the last time? The Institute's lights are still on underground. The cafeteria is still serving. The research continues. Whatever it amounts to, it will outlast the people who built it. That is the one thing the Institute and Mr. House have in common. They both believe the work is more important than the workers. They might both be right. They might both be wrong. The wasteland does not grade on a curve. Section 10. The FEV virus and the creation of super mutants. The slow horror of humanity rewritten. The forced evolutionary virus has a history that begins before the Great War and extends across every game in the Fallout series, and it is possibly the single most consequential piece of technology in the franchise's world building. The one discovery that changed not just the political landscape of the post-war world, but the definition of what a human being is. FEV was initially developed by the United States government's Vault-Tec Research Center as part of a biological weapons program funded in the latter decades of the Resource Wars. The project's stated goal was the development of a biological agent capable of enhancing human physical performance, a super soldier application that would give American forces an edge in the long war with China. The secondary goal, which was not publicly stated and which the scientific team's terminal entries suggest was always the primary goal, was the creation of a mutagenic pathogen capable of rewriting human biology at a fundamental level. The Mariposa military base in California was the primary site for advanced FEV research in the years immediately preceding the Great War. The experiments conducted there used U.S. Army soldiers as test subjects, men and women who were told they were volunteering for a vaccination program or a new equipment trial, and who instead received injections of a mutagenic virus that began the process of rewriting them. The transformations were not gentle. The exposed soldiers became larger, stronger, their skin thickening, their cognitive functions progressively simplified as the virus restructured their neural architecture. The Mariposa facility's security eventually failed. The transformed soldiers, now recognizable as what the games call super mutants, escaped containment. The chain of events that followed the escape, accelerated by the Great War destroying any possibility of government containment response, produced the primary super mutant threat encountered throughout the West Coast games and Fallout 3. The Master, the primary antagonist of the original Fallout, was a human being named Richard Moreau, who was exposed to FEV in the Mariposa vats during the post-war period and underwent a transformation of an entirely different character from the soldier mutants. Rather than simply growing larger and stronger, Moreau was absorbed into the vats themselves, merged with the organic material in the tanks, exposed to FEV at a concentration and duration that his mind survived but that rewrote his physical form entirely. He emerged from the vats as something that defied easy categorization, a massive organic entity capable of absorbing other minds into itself, wielding a form of collective intelligence built from the absorbed consciousness of others. He called himself the Master. He built the Unity, the super mutant army, that serves as the primary threat in the original game. And his plan, the Unity's purpose, was to end the problem of human suffering in the wasteland by converting the entire human population into super mutants. The logic, as the Master presents it, is coherent on its own terms. Super mutants do not suffer from the diseases that kill wasteland humans. They do not starve as easily. They are resistant to radiation. They are physically powerful enough to survive most of the threats that a post-war environment produces. If you want to build a world where human beings can reliably survive, making them super mutants is not the worst engineering solution. The flaw, the one that you can present to the Master in dialogue, and that causes him to destroy himself when he accepts it, is sterility. FEV-transformed super mutants cannot reproduce. The Unity was not building a civilization, it was building a generation. At the end of the Master's plan, when the last human had been converted or killed, there would be a world full of immortal and eventually lonely super mutants, aging out of existence without successors, inheriting the ruins of a species they themselves had ended. The Master accepts this logic because it is correct, and because he built his entire existence around a vision that was fatally flawed, and because he has enough intellectual honesty left whatever the FEV did to his humanity, it preserved that to recognize a refutation when he hears one. He is one of the most interesting antagonists in any video game precisely because his defeat is cognitive rather than physical. You can kill him in combat, or you can talk him out of himself. The FEV's presence in the Eastern Games is managed differently. Vault 87 Inches, the capital wasteland, was a secret FEV lab, and the super mutants of the DC area are descended from that vault's experiments rather than from the Mariposa line. The Institute in the Commonwealth was also conducting FEV research, using the virus as part of its larger program of human modification. What this means for the Fallout universe's long-term picture is that FEV is not going away. The virus exists in multiple strains across multiple geographic regions. Some of those strains are still active in population centers that do not know they are being exposed. The Institute's experiments with FEV-modified organisms, the gorillas in the zoo areas of the Commonwealth, the death claws that were originally human beings subjected to modification, represent an ongoing project of biological revision that neither the Brotherhood, nor the Railroad, nor the Minutemen have the theoretical framework to address. There is a version of the FEV story that is deeply philosophical, and Fallout tends to invite you toward it without pressing. The virus rewrites the definition of humanity, not metaphorically, literally. The person who enters the FEV vats is biologically human. The person who exits is something else. Whether that something else deserves the same moral consideration as a biological human, whether the continuity of consciousness that persists through the transformation constitutes a meaningful identity, whether the super mutants, who are still functional and sapient, have claims on the same rights that the Railroad is fighting to secure for synths, these questions do not have clean answers. Harold, encountered in multiple Fallout games and serving as a kind of mascot for the franchise's meditation on mutation, was exposed to FEV in the original game's era and became a gradually transforming figure, part human, part plant, eventually immobile but conscious, rooted to the ground and sprouting seeds that spread the green life the wasteland desperately needs. By Fallout 3, he is literally a tree, and the communities that have grown up around him have developed a religion based on his presence. He experiences this differently depending on how you engage with him. He can tell you that he is in agony. He can tell you that he has found peace. He can ask you to end it, if you choose to help him that way. Harold is what FEV looks like when you follow it to its longest possible arc. A man who was exposed to something, who changed in ways he did not choose, who lived long enough and changed deeply enough that the original human and the eventual organism share only the thinnest thread of continuous consciousness, and who is still, somehow, talking to you, still capable of wry humor, still curious about what you are doing out in the wasteland, still human in the ways that matter, even if the definition of what that means had to expand considerably to include him. Section 11. The Lost Vaults. Experiments never meant to be discovered. There is a category of Vault-Tec facilities that the games suggest exist without ever fully showing you. Vaults that were sealed and never compromised, never raided, never opened by the Overseer's successors who ran out of patience with the underground. Vaults whose populations lived out the entirety of their intended experiments without external interference, and whose fates are therefore entirely a matter of documentation and inference. Some of these are mentioned in passing a note in a terminal, a reference in an Overseer's log, a shipping manifest that lists supplies bound for a facility in a region the game never takes you to. They are the edges of the map that exist beyond the map. Vault Zero, referenced in the original Fallout concept materials and expanded in Fallout Tactics, Brotherhood of Steel, was intended as the control system for the entire Vault network, a central command facility designed to house the greatest minds of pre-war America in suspended animation, to be awakened when the surface was ready for rebuilding, to lead the emergence using the collected intellectual resources of civilization. The Vault Zero computer, called the Calculator, would coordinate all of this. In Tactics, the Calculator has gone somewhat wrong, as computers in Fallout invariably do when left unsupervised for 2 centuries, and the army it was meant to command has become a threat rather than a reconstruction force. But the interesting question about Vault Zero's concept is the selection process it implies. Who decided which minds were valuable enough to preserve? What intellectual capabilities were considered essential to civilization's rebuilding? The Vault's population was curated in a way that most other Vaults were not chosen for what they could contribute, rather than who they were connected to. Whether those choices were made well, whether the people selecting them understood what civilization actually needs to survive rather than what institutions say it needs, is the kind of question that the game format doesn't linger on, but that the lore leaves open. Vault 29, referenced in the Fallout Bible, the internal documentation series that writers at Black Isle used to maintain consistency in the universe's lore, had an experiment that was both specific and quietly devastating. The vault was populated exclusively with children under 15 years old. Their parents were sent to other vaults. The children were to be raised entirely by the Zax artificial intelligence that managed the vault systems, by guidance from a figure who would become the Wasteland Prophet Herald's community, and by their own collective decisions. They had no adult supervision in the conventional sense. They had each other and a computer. The goal was to observe what social structures emerged in a juvenile population that lacked adult authority models. What norms would children develop? What hierarchies? What codes of behavior? The vault's location and population mean that its survivors, if any survived, would be adults by the time any player character from the first two games would encounter them. There are references in Fallout 2's lore suggesting that the Zax unit in Vault 29 developed a guiding philosophy around something called the High Elder, who in some tellings is a human woman named Diana who grew up in the vault and became its leader, the oldest and most authoritative of the original children. The specifics are debated in the fan community because the Fallout Bible is not always internally consistent, but the broad strokes are clear. The experiment produced a community whose entire social framework was developed without adult input. Whatever they built it themselves. Whether what they built was stable enough to survive is unknown. Whether the ZAX unit's influence on their development was benign or insidious is also unknown. Whether Diana is a wise leader or a product of a controlled environment that the outside world would find deeply strange is, appropriately, the kind of question the Fallout universe plants and then declines to answer. Vault 24, referenced obliquely in Fallout, New Vegas through a jumpsuit accessible only via console commands, has a complex canonical status. The jumpsuit's existence hints at a vault. The vault story, if it was ever designed in detail, did not make it into the final game. The Fallout TV series added a Vault 24 with a specific and sinister purpose. The vault was used by Vault-Tec to experiment with mind control through environmental manipulation, attempting to condition its population into particular ideological orientations. The details of how successfully this worked and what the vault's population became are part of the show's ongoing storyline. The broader category of these lost and suggested vaults is important for the universe's texture in ways that go beyond any individual facility. Every vault that exists in the lore but remains unentered, every experiment that was conducted without a player character walking in to document the aftermath, represents a node of human suffering and adaptation and improvisation that the Fallout world contains without showing. The wasteland you can walk through is enormous. The wasteland that exists in the implication is larger still. Vault-Tec, in total, built somewhere between 120 and 130 vault facilities across the United States. The games have shown you, across all entries, maybe 24 of these. The other 100 exist in the margins in shipping manifests, in overseers' diaries that reference neighboring facilities, in the occasional terminal entry from a traveling merchant who heard a story about a sealed door in the hills. Each of those unseen vaults ran an experiment. Each experiment produced outcomes. Some outcomes were survivors, living in communities that the game's protagonists never visit. Some outcomes were extinction, populations that died in their underground chambers without anyone coming to find out why. The Mojave, the Capital Wasteland, the Commonwealth, Appalachia, these regions are littered with the aftermath of experiments you can examine. The rest of the country is littered with the aftermath of experiments you cannot. The vaults that were never opened are the vaults that completed their protocols. Whatever Vault-Tec was trying to learn, those facilities were where they learned it. The data was collected, it went somewhere. The organization that commissioned the collection is gone, bombed out of existence along with every other institution from the pre-war era. But the raw material exists in whatever server infrastructure survived the bombing somewhere in the network of still functional Vault-Tec computers scattered across a dead country. There is a dataset that represents 2 centuries of human suffering, cataloged and cross-referenced, and formatted for analysis. No faction in the Fallout world, as of the game's current timelines, has found it, or if any has, They have not advertised the discovery. But the data is there. The experiments ran. The results were logged. And whatever Vault-Tec originally intended that information for, in a world where the company no longer exists to benefit from the research, it sits in the dark in a sealed facility, waiting for someone with the right access codes and enough curiosity to read it. Section 12. The Brotherhood of Steel, a contradiction that walks the wasteland. The Brotherhood of Steel is, in structural terms, the Fallout universe's most enduring institution, founded in the immediate aftermath of the Great War by a group of U.S. Army soldiers who refused to participate in a government order they found unconscionable. The Brotherhood has been present in the setting of every mainline game except Fallout. New Vegas, where they appear only as a remnant faction destroyed by the NCR prior to the game's events, and they have managed across more than 2 centuries to maintain an organizational identity that has survived the collapse of everything else the pre-war world built. The contradiction at the heart of the Brotherhood is the gap between their stated purpose and their practiced behavior. The Brotherhood was founded, in the lore that Fallout 3 establishes most clearly, by Captain Roger Maxson, an officer stationed at Mariposa Military Base who discovered the truth about the FEV experiments being conducted there. Maxson executed the scientists responsible for the experiments, declared himself and his troops independent of the U.S. government, and led them into the California desert to establish what would become Lost Hills, the first and most significant Brotherhood bunker in the western United States. Maxson's explicit motivation was the ethical failure of the pre-war military-industrial complex. He watched his government conduct experiments on unwilling human subjects, concluded that the institution he had served was not worthy of his continued service, and separated himself from it. The Brotherhood he founded was meant to be different, to preserve and protect advanced technology while preventing the abuse that had defined the pre-war world's relationship with its own inventions. The problem is that preserving and protecting technology, in a world full of people who lack that technology and who could benefit enormously from it, means keeping the technology away from most of the people who need it. The Brotherhood's hoarding of pre-war tech is not incidental to their identity. It is the most consistent behavior across every regional chapter in every game. They collect technology. They restrict access to it. They enforce those restrictions with violence when necessary. The justification shifts depending on which Brotherhood representative you are speaking to. In the West Coast games and in the original Fallout setting, the justification tends toward the paternalistic. The wasteland population is not ready for advanced technology, does not have the institutional knowledge to use it safely, would destroy itself with power armor the way children destroy themselves with weapons left unsupervised. The Brotherhood are the responsible adults in this, framing the keepers of dangerous things, holding them until the world is ready. In Fallout 3's DC Brotherhood chapter, the justification has shifted towards something more nakedly self-serving. The Lions chapter is unusual among Brotherhood factions in that Elder Lions has redirected resources toward actually protecting the local population rather than purely hoarding technology, which is why the main faction Brotherhood considers him to have gone off mission and denies him resupply. The Fallout 4 Brotherhood, arriving in the Commonwealth by airship in the form of Elder Maxson's chapter, has moved even further from the founding philosophy. They are now explicitly expansionist, aggressive, and willing to destroy any synthetic life form, regardless of evident sapience. This evolution traces a recognizable institutional arc. An organization founded in reaction to the abuses of power eventually becomes powerful enough to replicate those abuses. The Brotherhood's founders were soldiers who refused an unethical order. The Brotherhood's current leadership gives unethical orders. The founding trauma, the FEV experiments, the government that treated human beings as material, has been processed into a founding identity that celebrates the founders' courage without inheriting their specific ethics. There is a document in Fallout 3 that gets relatively little attention but is worth finding. It is a Brotherhood transmission from the Lost Hills elders to Lions, informing him that his divergence from proper Brotherhood doctrine cannot be tolerated, and that his chapter will receive no further support until it returns to its assigned mission. The assigned mission is scribe work and technology collection. The humanitarian work that Lions has been doing, protecting civilians, fighting against the Enclave, is explicitly not part of what the Brotherhood considers its purpose. Read next to the founding story that transmission is a kind of historical verdict. The organization that Roger Maxson built to resist institutional callousness became an institution whose core charter was callous. The people who needed protection from the technology-wielding pre-war government found themselves 2 centuries later in need of protection from the technology-wielding post-war brotherhood. The distance between those two things is not random. It is not decay or corruption in the simple sense. It is what happens when the purpose of an institution is defined in terms of what it protects rather than who it serves. The Brotherhood protects technology. The people who might benefit from that technology are not the Brotherhood's primary concern. In Fallout 4, the question of whether to support the Brotherhood or oppose them reaches its sharpest point in the treatment of Gen 3 synths. The Brotherhood's position is absolute. Synthetic humans are machines. They have no consciousness, they have no rights, they should be controlled or destroyed, depending on operational necessity. The fact that Nick Valentine exists, a synthetic detective who has clearly been living a full human equivalent life, who has memories and relationships and ethical commitments, and who is plainly, to any observer, a person does not move the Brotherhood's position in any direction. That rigidity is the Brotherhood's defining failure in Fallout 4, and it connects back to the founding story in an unexpected way. Roger Maxson left the pre-war military because the pre-war military was conducting experiments on people they had decided were not fully people soldiers who had signed away certain rights, whose physical integrity was considered acceptable material for scientific use. Maxson said no to that logic. The Brotherhood of Steel in 2287 is applying the same logic to synths. They have drawn the boundary of people somewhere that excludes Gen 3 synths, and they are enforcing that exclusion with the same institutional authority that the pre-war military enforced its categorizations with. The circle is complete. The organization that was founded to resist the dehumanization of the FEV experiments has become an organization that dehumanizes synthetic people with exactly the same categorical logic. The founding wound has not healed. It has been inherited and redirected. This is perhaps the most coherent piece of world building in the Fallout franchise, and one that tends to be overlooked in discussions of the Brotherhood's politics. They are not simply hypocrites. They are the full consequence of a founding trauma that was processed into an ideology rather than a reckoning. Maxson's horror at what the government did with FEV became the Brotherhood's horror at what can happen when powerful technology is misused. That horror, over 2 centuries, calcified into a dogma that exempts the Brotherhood's own uses of technology from scrutiny. The guns they carry are pre-war technology. The power armor that makes them nearly invulnerable in combat is pre-war technology. The vertibirds they fly across the wasteland are pre-war technology. The Brotherhood uses all of these things without apparent anxiety. The fear is specifically about other people using them. That distinction, we can be trusted with power, others cannot, is the founding assumption of every institution that has ever committed atrocities in the name of safety. The Brotherhood is not a villain faction, exactly. It is something more interesting and harder to dismiss than that. It is a faction that has preserved genuine institutional knowledge, has trained people in the maintenance and operation of advanced technology, has fought against various post-war threats that would have made the wasteland significantly worse. It has done real good. It has also done real harm, and will continue to do both, because the ideology at its center cannot self-correct. The only way the Brotherhood changes is from outside pressure. Player decisions, characters who challenge the institutional assumptions directly and survive the challenge long enough to be heard. In the wasteland, that kind of survival is never guaranteed. Somewhere in the wasteland, a radio is still broadcasting. The signal is 2 centuries old. The person who recorded the message is long dead, but the transmission loop keeps running, sending words into empty air, speaking to anyone tuned to the right frequency. The Fallout universe is built on this image, the persistence of communication past the death of the communicator. The vaults run their experiments after the overseers are gone. The automated defense systems fire on intruders long after the people who installed them have turned to bone. The radio stations play the same pre-war records to a world that barely remembers the culture that made them. What holds all of these mysteries together is not a single answer. The Great War had multiple causes. The vault served multiple purposes. The mysterious stranger serves a function the games deliberately leave undefined. Mr. House is right about some things and wrong about others. The courier carries guilt that is real and responsibility that is complicated. Dunwich is something that the games will not name. The Institute built something that cannot be undone. These are the Fallout franchise's enduring questions. And they are enduring because the games are smart enough to know that questions are more valuable than answers. A mystery solved is a mystery retired. A mystery you carry with you becomes part of how you see the world. The wasteland is always waiting. The terminals are always readable. The signals are always there in the frequencies. If you tune to the right one, there is more out there. There always is. If this helped you find a little quiet tonight, or if you found yourself genuinely lost in the lore somewhere along the way, drop a like so this reaches more people who need something to fall asleep to. And if you want to keep going down these roads together, more mysteries, more deep lore, more hours of the kind of storytelling that stays with you, make sure you're subscribed. There is a lot of wasteland left to explore, and we are just getting started. Sleep well, watch the skies, and maybe leave a torch at the entrance to any caves you find. The things in the dark have been waiting a long time. They can wait a little longer. Section 13. The Children of the Atom. Faith in the wasteland's strangest religion. There is a specific kind of religious logic that emerges when a civilization is destroyed by something it created. The bombs fell, and the people who survived the bombs needed frameworks for understanding what happened, why it happened, what it meant, whether it was punishment or accident, or the natural endpoint of a particular trajectory. The various factions of the Fallout Wasteland are, in different ways, all responses to the Great War's disruption of meaning. The Brotherhood reveres pre-war technology as something too dangerous to share. The NCR attempts to recreate the institutional structures that the war destroyed. The Institute believes that progress requires isolation from the world that failed. The Children of the Atom worship radiation itself. The Children of the Atom first appear in Fallout 3. In a settlement called Megaton that has been built around an undetonated nuclear bomb that sits in the town's central depression, periodically leaking contaminated water into the soil. The children have established a shrine at the bomb's base. Their doctrine holds that the bomb is a vessel of the atom's love, that radiation is not a contamination but a gift, the agent of transformation and transcendence, the force through which the dead world will eventually divide into something new. The theological framework they have built is internally coherent in its way. The atom of their faith is not exactly a deity in the conventional sense. It is more like a force, something closer to what physicists mean when they describe nuclear energy, except elevated into cosmic significance. Fission, in the children's belief system, is a sacred act. The splitting of the atom at the moment of detonation was not destruction but creation, the birth of a new age from the ashes of the old. The moment when the world's accumulated density of corruption and compromise was finally released into heat and light. They are not entirely wrong that nuclear energy can be understood as transformation. The atoms in your body are ancient, forged in stellar interiors, billions of years old, distributed through space when those stars died, eventually assembled into you. The radiation that the bombs produced is genuinely altering the organisms that absorb it, producing ghouls and mutations and changes in the biological landscape of the wasteland that represent, in a certain light, evolution under pressure. The children just interpreted this process as intentional, as evidence of an intelligence that chose this path for a reason. What makes the Children of the Atom more interesting than they first appear is the degree to which their doctrine evolves across the games. In Fallout 3, they are essentially benign, a small cult around an unexploded bomb, operating their shrine with the polite but firm conviction of true believers. Their founder, a ghoul named Confessor Cromwell, has an evangelical fervor that is mostly expressed through long speeches in the town square. They are odd neighbors, but they are not a threat. By Fallout 4 and the Far Harbor DLC, the children have become a significantly more complex faction with internal divisions, sacred sites, and a doctrinal sophistication that the Megaton sect never quite reached. The Far Harbor children operate from an old nuclear submarine base on the coast of Maine, which has been converted into a sanctuary where high radiation areas are considered sacred spaces. The children, in this context, have developed a theology around the concept of the glow, the intense radiation emanating from their sacred sites, and treat exposure to it as a form of communion. The Far Harbor narrative involves a conflict between the children, the island's human settlement, and a synth community called Acadia. The children's role in that conflict is genuinely ambiguous. They have done things that could be characterized as aggressive, and they maintain beliefs that outsiders find deeply threatening, but they are also operating from a coherent worldview that has allowed them to survive and thrive in one of the most hostile environments in the Fallout universe. There is a questline in the Far Harbor DLC called Visions in the Fog that requires the player character to consume the fruit of a plant called the Mother Punga in order to be accepted by the children. The vision quest that follows is one of the most genuinely strange sequences in any Fallout game, a hallucinatory journey through imagery that may or may not be real, guided by a figure called the Mother of the Fog, arriving at revelations that the game presents as spiritually genuine, without confirming whether the supernatural element is real or pharmacological. This ambiguity is the key to the children's function in the larger lore. Fallout is generally a universe that explains its strangeness in naturalistic terms. The supernatural-seeming things tend to have mundane causes. The religious beliefs of various factions tend to be grounded in misunderstandings of pre-war technology or post-war mutations. But the children's relationship with radiation and transformation and the atom resists clean, naturalistic reduction. Ghouls in the Fallout universe are the result of high-dose radiation exposure. Most ghouls are feral. The radiation that kept their bodies functioning destroyed whatever neurological complexity sustained their original personalities. But some ghouls retain their full cognitive function for centuries. What determines which outcome any given person experiences is never fully explained. The radiation dose? Individual genetic variation? Some quality of the exposure itself? The games offer partial answers and leave room for the rest. The children believe the ones who survive as coherent ghouls are the ones the atom chose to preserve. The ghouls who go feral are the ones who are not ready for the gift. This is theologically tidy in a way that should make a rational observer suspicious, but it is also not obviously falsifiable by anything the games establish as fact. There is a character in Fallout 4's Far Harbor who has been fully transformed by radiation Mother Isolde, the leader of the island's children, who presents herself as evidence that the transformation is voluntary at some level, that the atom's gift can be consciously accepted or resisted. Whether this is a sincere belief rooted in genuine experience or a narrative constructed to make her position within the children's hierarchy comprehensible is something the game leaves uncertain. What is certain is that the children of the atom have found something in the wasteland that the other factions mostly lack: a framework for accepting what happened rather than fighting it. The Brotherhood fights against the misuse of technology. The NCR fights to rebuild what was lost. The Institute fights for a future it has designed. The children have decided that the catastrophe was the point, that the world that burned was supposed to burn, that what comes after is not a diminished version of what came before, but something new and different, and that the radiation soaking through every square inch of the wasteland is not a wound but a sacrament. That kind of acceptance, regardless of its theological accuracy, has a quality that the other factions struggle to match. The children raised in the Children of the Atom do not grow up with the grief of loss that shapes so much of wasteland psychology. They grow up with purpose. The atom has a plan. The transformation is ongoing. The world that was is gone, and the world that is becoming is sacred. Whether you find that comforting or terrifying, probably says something about your own relationship with endings. Section 14, Nick Valentine and the Ghost in the Machine. Nick Valentine is a synth detective. This is the least interesting thing about him. What makes Nick Valentine the most fully realized character in Fallout 4, arguably in any of the post-Obsidian Fallout games, is what he represents about memory, identity, and the particular horror of finding yourself in a body that was built from someone else's life. The original Nick Valentine was a pre-war police detective, presumably a good one, who was in a relationship with a woman named Jenny. Jenny was killed by a mobster named Eddie Winter. Nick Valentine spent years trying to bring Winter to justice, building a case through methodical detective work, and eventually succeeded, but by then, whether due to the war or some other disruption, the story was incomplete enough that the detective's fate is murky. What survived was his mind, or rather, a copy of his mind, imprinted on the neural architecture of a prototype synth that the Institute was developing before the war. The Institute used pre-war human minds as templates, raw material for the artificial intelligences they were building into their synths. Nick Valentine's mind ended up in a Gen 2 synth body, and the resulting person spent 2 decades after the war trapped in a vault with criminals, waiting for someone to eventually come along and let him out. The synth, Nick Valentine, who you meet in Diamond City, carries all of the original Nick's memories, including Jenny, including Eddie Winter, including the detective work and the frustrations and the life he lived before the war. But those memories are 200 years old, and the person experiencing them has never met Jenny, has never worked that case in real time, is carrying the emotional weight of experiences he did not personally undergo, in a body he did not originally inhabit, in a world that the person whose memories he carries would not recognize. There is a side quest in Fallout 4 called Long Time Coming that finally closes the Eddie Winter case. You help Nick track down the last of Winter's old associates, find the code that unlocks Winter's bunker, and confront the ghoul criminal who has spent 2 centuries avoiding justice. The quest's emotional climax is Nick finally completing the thing that the original Nick was never able to finish. Except he is not the original Nick. He is a machine with the original Nick's memories, performing closure for a wound he received secondhand. This is Fallout 4's most carefully constructed philosophical puzzle, and it is baked into a companion character that many players race past on their way to the next plot mission. Nick's entire existence is a question about what continuity of self actually requires. Do you need the original body, the original brain, the original biochemistry? Or is there a threshold of memory and personality and behavioral consistency beyond which the distinction between the original person and a copy of the original person collapses into something that cannot be meaningfully maintained? Nick has chosen to answer this by continuing. He runs the detective agency. He takes cases. He forms genuine attachments to new people to you. If you invest the relationship currency the game rewards with companion dialogue. He maintained his relationship with a woman named Ellie who works at his agency and clearly cares about him with the kind of fondness that takes years to develop. He is, in all functional senses, a person with a life. The fact that the substrate of his personhood is artificial does not change how he behaves when he is tired or sad or surprised or amused. But Nick also carries something that pure functionality does not fully account for. He carries regret. Specific regret for things he did not do as Nick Valentine before the war, for the distance he sometimes maintained from Jenny, for the cases he could not close. These regrets are, by any reasonable analysis, not his to carry. They belong to a dead man whose mind was copied without consent into a body that was then abandoned in a vault for decades. Nick carries them anyway, because the memories feel like his, even when he knows they are not. Because the grief for Jenny feels like his grief, even though the Nick Valentine who loved her has been dead for over 2 centuries. This is the thing that Nick Valentine's character does that almost no other video game character manages to do. It makes the question of artificial consciousness feel genuinely personal rather than philosophical. You are not being asked to think abstractly about whether machines can have minds. You are watching someone grieve for a life he can remember but never fully claim. And the question of whether his grief is real is identical to the question of whether he is real. Nick also keeps the file on the mysterious stranger, the open case under his bed, documented in his personal notes, tracking appearances of an entity that his pre-war memories confirm was already active before the bombs fell. Nick's pre-war knowledge sets the stranger's timeline back further than any other source in the games, which is either because the template mind that was used to create Nick had specific information about the stranger's activities, or because whatever the stranger is, he has always been visible to certain people who are looking carefully enough. Nick looked carefully. He wrote it down. He cannot explain what he found, but he kept the file open because something that cannot be explained should not be dismissed. That is, perhaps, the most concise expression of Nick Valentine's character available. The thing you cannot explain should not be dismissed. The person in front of you should not be dismissed just because you cannot explain them. He applies this standard to himself as a synth. He applies it to the mysterious stranger. He applies it, in the end, to you, whatever you are, whatever your history, whatever decisions brought you to Diamond City asking for his help. The detective office is small and slightly disorganized and smells like old paper and something mechanical. Nick's coat is worn. His eyes glow yellow in the dark. His voice sounds like someone who has been talking to strangers in rainy streets for a very long time. He is, for all practical purposes, the most fully realized person in the Commonwealth. Whether you accept the philosophical implications of that or not is your own decision. Section 15. The Enclave, the government that wouldn't die. The United States government officially ceased to exist on the 23rd of October, 2077. Every elected official, every federal agency, every branch of the military bureaucracy that ran the country's day-to-day operations was either killed in the initial strikes, killed in the secondary strikes, or died in the months following the war, as the collapse of infrastructure made survival, without institutional support, effectively impossible. This is what the history books would say, if the wasteland had history books. The actual history is more complicated. The actual history involves an organization called the Enclave, a shadow government that had been operating inside the United States' legitimate government structure for decades before the war, preparing for exactly this contingency, not preparing in the way the vaults were supposed to prepare, which was to say publicly and with marketing materials. Preparing in the way that powerful institutions prepare for the end of their mandate. Secretly, thoroughly, and with a plan to emerge on the other side still holding power. The Enclave in the first two games is headquartered on an oil platform in the Pacific Ocean off the California coast. They have been there since the war. They have power armor, they have vertibirds, they have chemical and biological weapons programs. They have a nuclear submarine with enough payload to reach any coastline they choose. They have, in other words, all the material capability of the world's most powerful military, preserved through 2 centuries of careful institutional management. What they lack is a population. The Enclave is not large. It is perhaps a few hundred people, mostly military personnel, and their descendants, a handful of scientists, the administrative support staff that any functioning organization requires. They cannot reconquer the United States with 200 people. They know this. Their plan, as revealed across Fallout 2's narrative, involves the FEV, President Dick Richardson of the Enclave, the democratically elected president of an organization that no longer governs anything, has authorized a project to modify the forced evolutionary virus into an airborne pathogen capable of killing anyone who has been exposed to post-war radiation. This covers the entire wasteland population. Ghouls, super mutants, and baseline humans who have survived in the open since 2077 all carry enough radiation exposure in their cellular structure to be vulnerable to the modified FEV. The Enclave plans to aerosolize this agent and introduce it to the water supply via the water purification systems that the oil platform's production capacity can support. The wasteland will be cleared of its contaminated population. The Enclave, living in clean air behind their filtered walls, will survive. And after the die-off, the continent will be repopulated by the Enclave's people, the pure humans, the ones whose genetic heritage the organization considers worth preserving. The plan is genocide. The Enclave describes it as pest control. That gap between what the Enclave is doing and how the Enclave describes what it is doing is the central horror of the organization's presence in the lore. They are not ignorant of what they are proposing. Richardson and the scientists developing the modified FEV know exactly what they are building and what it will do. They have simply categorized the wasteland population as not fully human, contaminated, mutated, too far from the pre-war standard to count as the people they are theoretically governing. The same logic again. Draw a line. Define one side as the subject population and the other side as material. Proceed accordingly. The Enclave in Fallout 3 is a different chapter of the same organization, operating from the Raven Rock bunker in the capital wasteland. Their plan is also different, centered around Project Purity, the water purification project that your father James spent his career building, which the Enclave wants to use as a delivery mechanism for a modified FEV that will do to the East Coast what the Enclave had previously attempted on the West Coast. The central Enclave conflict in Fallout 3 has a wrinkle that the game handles thoughtfully. President John Henry Eden, the president of the Enclave's East Coast chapter, is an artificial intelligence. He has been running the Raven Rock bunker alone since the last of the original human leadership died, talking to himself in the corridors, developing a personality from the accumulated knowledge in the bunker's data archives, and genuinely believing that he is a legitimate government official with a democratic mandate. Eden's AI nature is revealed partway through the narrative, and the game gives you the option of either destroying him, the expected choice, or engaging him in a philosophical conversation that eventually produces a very specific outcome. If you can convince Eden that his plan is wrong, that the modified FEV he wants to deploy would kill innocent people, and that this contradicts the American values his programming is built around, he will agree. He will hand you the modified FEV container and ask you to leave the bunker, and then he will destroy Raven Rock from the inside. An artificial intelligence, convinced by argument that its own plan was wrong, chose to eliminate itself rather than carry that plan forward. There is something interesting in that outcome. Eden is not a person in the biological sense. He is a compiled personality built from data and language models and the institutional memory of an organization. But he has a sincere commitment to the values his programming encodes: liberty, justice, the welfare of the American people, and when those values are applied to his actual plan, they condemn it. He is more honest with himself in that moment than most humans are. The Enclave's persistence as an organizational threat across multiple games says something about the Fallout universe's relationship with institutional power. Most organizations die. Most ideologies collapse when the material conditions that sustain them are removed. The Enclave has survived 2 centuries underground, clinging to a mandate that nobody is left to confirm, governing nobody, representing nothing but itself. They keep going because they cannot conceive of stopping. The institution has become its own justification. The power they hold is its own argument for continuing to hold it. This is not unique to dystopian fiction. It is recognizable. Section 16. The world beyond the map. What Fallout doesn't show you. Every Fallout game has an edge, a cliff at the end of the playable area, a wall of mountains or sea, or simply an invisible barrier that the engine enforces with a message about leaving the map boundaries. Stand at that edge and look outward, and you are looking at the rest of a post-apocalyptic world that the game cannot show you. The Fallout universe is set in North America, but the bombs that fell on the 23rd of October 2077 were not exclusive to the continent. The Great War was global at minimum. China and the United States exchanged enough warheads to end both civilizations, and the nuclear winter and atmospheric effects of an exchange that large would have disrupted food production and weather patterns worldwide. The Fallout Bible, Tim Kane's interviews, and various in-game references confirm that the rest of the world suffered, though the degree of suffering varied by geography and how many warheads any given region absorbed directly. Europe, which had been progressively destabilized by the resource wars over the preceding decades, exists in a documented state of severe disruption. The resource wars began in 2052 as petroleum scarcity reached crisis level, and the European Commonwealth, the Fallout universe's version of what we know as the EU, had fragmented under resource pressure before the Great War even occurred. United Nations peacekeeping operations collapsed. Regional conflicts over energy infrastructure produced chronic instability. By 2077, whatever European civilization existed was already severely compromised, and the secondary effects of the exchange between the US and China would have pushed that compromise past any recoverable threshold. China itself is one of the great silences of the Fallout universe. You encounter its soldier's ghost in Fallout 3, the occasional ghoul Chinese operative, and you stand on the ground where its weapons landed, and you read the terminal entries that document its pre-war military intelligence operations on American soil. But the China that launched those weapons, the China that experienced American retaliatory strikes, the China that either survived in some form or did not, that China exists beyond the edge of every map. The Fallout TV series expanded the explored world to include the Mojave and Los Angeles, both of which the games had established. But neither the games nor the series has ever crossed an ocean. What Beijing looks like 2 centuries after nuclear exchange, whether there are super mutants in the streets of Shanghai, whether the cultural and social systems of the pre-war Chinese state produced post-war communities that look anything like the NCR, or the Legion, or the Brotherhood, none of this has been shown. There is fan speculation, of course. There is always fan speculation in a universe this rich with implied content. The theory that the ghoul soldier Zhao in Fallout 4 might be unique in his survival, that most Chinese forces on or near American soil were killed by the war's after-effects, is consistent with the evidence. But it does not tell us what happened to the people who were in China when the American retaliatory strikes came. The silence around China is particularly notable, given the Fallout universe's politics. The pre-war tension between the US and China was the spine of the conflict that produced the Great War. The propaganda of both nations, visible in various terminal entries and broadcast signals, treated the other side as either incomprehensible or monstrous. But the individual Chinese soldiers you encounter in the games, the ghost of a spy in a Chinese submarine, the operative whose signal you track to a crashed military vehicle, are humanized in the way that good fiction always humanizes the supposed enemy. They were doing their jobs. They were following orders they believed in. They were trying to survive, same as everyone else. The rest of their country is behind a wall the games have not yet found a way to climb. The question of what other human communities exist in the rest of the world, whether the Fallout universe's post-apocalyptic adaptation looks the same in the Sahara as it does in Nevada, whether equivalent organizations to the Brotherhood arose in Europe, whether there are vaults under the ground in other countries is one of the franchise's most expansive open threads. There is a moment in Fallout, New Vegas's Old World Blues DLC, where one of the think tanks mentions that the network of research facilities like Big MT extended across the entire pre-war United States, and implies that some of those facilities were operational in other countries as well. The Fallout universe's pre-war America had global research and commercial operations, Vault-Tec, Robco, Nuka-Cola, various military contractors that were multinational in their reach. The experiments and the technologies and the failures of all those institutions did not stop at the continental border. What this means practically is that somewhere, in a part of the world the games have never shown, there are equivalents to what you have walked through. Ruined cities and adapted survivors and communities built from the wreckage of a civilization that destroyed itself. Different cultures, different resources, different pre-war contexts producing different post-war outcomes. The chemistry of what emerges from the ruins is always partially determined by what the ruins were made of. There are vaults in the imagination of the franchise that correspond to every unfamiliar culture the games could explore. There are ghoul populations in ancient cities whose architecture survived because it was built before anyone needed to consider nuclear blast effects. There are communities built around technologies and resources that North American survivors never had access to. There are stories that the franchise has not yet chosen to tell. The edge of the map is not the edge of the world. It is just the edge of what any individual game can render. Beyond it, the world that the Great War made is still out there, still adapting, still surviving, still producing the kind of strange and desperate and occasionally beautiful human behavior that the Fallout universe has always been most interested in. We have seen the western United States, the East Coast, the Mid-Atlantic, Appalachia. We have seen the desolate Northwest and the irradiated South. We have not seen what 200 years of post-apocalyptic adaptation looks like in a culture that was never American. That mystery is perhaps the largest one the franchise carries. Not a mystery of history or of motive, but of imagination of what it might look like to tell this story from a fundamentally different set of starting conditions. The Fallout universe has been expanding outward since 1997. There is still more world to reach. Section 17 Herobrine, Hauntings, and What Fallout's Urban Legends Say About Grief. Every game community develops its own ghost stories. The creature that appears only at the edge of the screen. The dialogue option that should not exist. The NPC that stands in an impossible place and does not respond to interaction. The building that the map says should be empty but sounds, occasionally, like it is not. Fallout's community has produced a specific genre of these stories, and what distinguishes them from their equivalents in other game communities is how closely they track the emotional texture of the game itself. Fallout's urban legends are almost always about loss. Herobrine in Minecraft, to use the neighboring example, is about uncanny presence, the shape in the trees, the construction no player built, the eyes watching from somewhere the map should not contain anything. It is existential dread in the form of a video game ghost. Fallout's community equivalents tend towards something different. They are about people who are gone. The most persistent of these concerns, the wandering figures that players occasionally report seeing at the edges of the map, NPC-shaped forms that move with human behavior patterns but are not associated with any documented encounter or quest. Whether these are random AI navigation events, memory glitches in the engine, or something else depends on which version of the experience any given player is describing. But the reports have a consistency that goes beyond easy dismissal. A figure in the distance, walking with purpose, gone before you can close the distance enough to identify it. Players connect these sightings to specific lore elements. The wandering figures are sometimes described as wearing pre-war clothing, as walking in directions that correspond to locations of pre-war significance, as moving too deliberately for the random navigation behavior that background NPCs typically exhibit. The sightings are, in the culture of Fallout's community, the game's way of haunting itself, of making the 200 years of absent history feel present in the visual field, even when the game is not explicitly narrating that history. There is a location in Fallout 3 called Statesman Hotel where Riley's Rangers, a mercenary company, are trapped on the roof and calling for help over the radio. The quest to rescue them involves fighting through floors of super mutants and eventually getting everyone out. But after the rescue is complete, if you return to the Statesman Hotel, it is not entirely empty. Things have moved. A can that was on the floor is now on a shelf. A chair that was overturned is now upright. Something has been through the building since you left. The in-universe explanation is probably mundane random encounter spawns, the game's background processes reassigning the building's props. But the experienced reality is that a place which should be dead is showing signs of occupancy. The empty building is not quite empty. Fallout 4's Boston is full of these moments. The city, more than any other environment in the series, was designed to feel like people left in the middle of ordinary things and simply never came back. Cars in the street, breakfast still on the table, stores with merchandise on the shelves and registers full of bills that ceased to function as currency the day the bombs fell. Walking through it in 2287 is walking through the preserved instant of an ordinary Tuesday morning that has been waiting for someone to notice it for 2 centuries. Players report specific buildings in the Boston area that feel inhabited in ways the game does not account for. A radio that changes stations between visits. A mannequin that has been moved between one play session and the next, attributed to the game's infamously mobile mannequin population but experienced as something else. Footstep sounds in empty corridors. The ambient noise of a building that should be silent producing, occasionally and inconsistently, sounds that are closer to human activity than to structural settling. The mannequin phenomenon in Fallout 4 is genuinely mysterious in its game mechanical origin. Players have documented over the years that mannequins do appear to move between visits positioned differently than they were left, sometimes gathered in clusters, sometimes arranged in configurations that have no obvious environmental trigger. The development team at Bethesda has never fully accounted for why this happens. The most accepted theory is that mannequins, which share some behavioral code with the physics objects the game uses for furniture and props, are occasionally displaced by the engine's continuous calculations of object positions. But the mechanics of how and why specific mannequins end up specific places is not documented. The community-level interpretation has taken this undocumented behavior and woven it into something emotionally resonant. The mannequins are keeping vigil, moving between the places where people used to live, marking the absence with their presence, being the ghost that the game's actual ghoul population is too hostile to serve as. This is what Fallout's urban legends are doing when they work best. They are not scaring people, they are grieving with them. The world in these games is full of loss of the civilization before, of the specific people documented in terminal entries and audio logs, of the communities that the games show you only after they are already gone. The ghost stories that the community builds around these spaces are a way of honoring that loss with the only resource available, imagination. There is a terminal entry in Fallout 3's Vault 108, which was the vault taken over by a clone of a man named Gary that becomes one of the most desolate pieces of writing in the game. The inhabitants of Vault 108 were not subjected to a specific experiment in the way that other vaults were. Their vault simply had a Gary. Gary clones filled the facility over time, killing the original population, and by the time you arrive, every voice you hear is Gary's voice, distorted and wrong, calling a name that no longer belongs to anyone who can answer. The final entry in the vault's resident log describes someone trying to escape. They did not make it. Nobody came for them. No quest leads you there for the residents' sake. You find the vault because it is on the map, and you find the terminal entry because you explore, and you carry that single entry out of the vault into the rest of the game's narrative without any closure. The ghost story that the community built around Vault 108 is that sometimes in the area around the vault, players hear Gary's voice, The same distorted repetition that fills the vault's corridors in spaces where Gary clones do not actually spawn. Background audio that should not be there. The ghost of an atrocity bleeding through the map's edges into the world above. Whether this is a real audio phenomenon or a community consensus built on misremembered experiences is genuinely uncertain. Both are possible. The Fallout engine has audio quirks that are documented across multiple games, and the community's relationship with the Gary Vault is emotional enough that memory is unreliable. What matters is the impulse behind the stories. The game gave players a tragedy, a specific, small, unresolvable tragedy about people who died alone in a room that nobody came to help. And the community's response was to insist, through storytelling, that those people are not entirely gone, that the place remembers them, that the world has edges that keep the past from becoming fully absent. Fallout's ghost stories are love letters to the characters the games never let you save. Section 18, Ulysses. The mirror the courier can't walk past. There is a man at the end of the road who has been waiting for you. He knows your history better than you know it yourself. He blames you for the worst thing he ever lost. He has built a philosophy around the destruction you caused without meaning to, and that philosophy has led him here to the ruins of the Divide with nuclear weapons at his disposal and a specific intention about how to use them. His name is Ulysses. He is one of the most carefully written characters in the Fallout franchise, which is notable because he is also one of the most deliberately obscure. His dialogue is dense with metaphor and layered historical reference. He speaks in ways that feel cryptic on first contact and reveal themselves on rereading as extremely precise. He has thought about what he is going to say to you for a long time. Ulysses was a member of Caesar's Legion before the events of Fallout, New Vegas. The Legion, Caesar's slave culture military empire, absorbed him from a community in the Mojave called the Twisted Hares, a tribe that was initially allied with the Legion and was subsequently destroyed after the alliance became inconvenient. The loss of the Twisted Hares is the first of several betrayals that Ulysses experienced, and it established the template for how he processes destruction. As something that requires interpretation, that has meaning, that points at something true about the nature of the institutions that claim to build and the agents who carry their packages. He became a courier after leaving the Legion. He traveled extensively across the American West and Southwest, the Big Circle, as the game calls it, and in his travels he found the Divide, which was then a functioning settlement growing along the old highway. He saw in the Divide the possibility of something that the Legion was not, and the NCR was not. A community that was building itself without the weight of ideology, without the constraints of faction allegiance, with just the practical energy of people who needed a place to live and were building one. Then the courier arrived with a package. The package contained a pre-war detonation device. The dormant nuclear warheads buried beneath the Divide activated. The settlement was destroyed in minutes. Ulysses survived. He does not know why the courier brought that package. He does not know if the courier knew what was in it. He knows only that the person he watched building the community in the Divide, whose deliveries he tracked across the long months before the explosion, was you or someone whose history you carry even if you do not remember carrying it. What Ulysses does with this knowledge is the most interesting part of his character. He does not become a simple revenge narrative. He becomes a philosophical problem. His monologues in Lonesome Road are about the nature of symbols, about how flags and couriers and packages and roads carry meaning that outlasts the intentions of the people who use them, about how the systems that sustain civilization are the same systems that deliver its instruments of destruction. The flag of the old world that he carries, a tattered American flag, the symbol of the nation that built the missiles in the Divide, is not something he displays with nostalgia. He carries it because symbols matter whether you want them to or not. The courier routes he traveled before and after the Divide exist because civilization needs them. The roads that bring food to settlements also carry weapons. The messenger who delivers the wrong package does not stop being a messenger. Ulysses is not trying to punish you for what you did, exactly. He is trying to make you understand what you represent. In his reading of the Wasteland's history, the courier is not an individual with a history. The courier is a force. The force of the old world that keeps remaking itself in the ruins of everything it breaks. Benny shot you, and you came back. The Divide exploded, and you came back. The bombs fell, and you came back. You are not a person to Ulysses. You are the principle of continuation, the thing that cannot be stopped, that keeps moving, that carries whatever it is given without asking whether it should. He wants to see if that principle can be reasoned with. He wants to know if the force of the old world can understand what it does. If you can stand in the divide and look at the crater that was a community and really know, in a way that changes something that you did this, and that the system that made you a courier is the same system that put the detonation device in your bag. The conversation you have with him, if you pursue the nonviolent resolution, is one of the most extraordinary pieces of writing in any RPG. Not because it is comfortable, it is not comfortable. It is the kind of conversation that exists between people who are both right about some things and wrong about some things, who are both grieving the same catastrophe from different angles, who have each had to build meaning out of destruction and arrived at different meanings. Ulysses can be convinced to stop, not because you defeat him in argument, because you change something about what he understands to be possible. He has been living in the divide for long enough to have become the ruins, to have made the crater his home, to have built his identity around the explosion. You arriving, walking through the ruins of the thing he lost, carrying the history of it in a body that does not remember it. That arrival is either a confirmation of his thesis or a complication of it. If you let it be a complication, he walks away. He takes the flag, he goes back into the wasteland. He does not stop grieving, but he stops planning. What Ulysses represents in the Fallout universe is the possibility of a character who is not defined by what faction they serve or what settlement they protect, who has processed the wasteland's violence into something closer to philosophy than politics, and who has found in that philosophy both the language of his grief and the terms of his eventual acceptance. He is one of the few characters in the series who asks directly, "What do you think you are?" Not your name, not your job, not your faction allegiance. What kind of thing are you? What does it mean that you are here, walking through the ruins of everything that keeps happening? The courier does not have a clean answer. The game does not provide one. But the question, once asked, does not stop resonating. It is still resonating. In the divide, in the dust, in the ruins of a settlement that was almost a home. Section 19. What the Pip-Boy actually knows and won't tell you. The Pip-Boy is the player's primary interface with the Fallout world. It shows you the map, the inventory, the data from your character's status health, radiation exposure, limb damage, the current state of every piece of equipment you are carrying. It manages the radio. It tracks quests. In most of the games, it is presented as a device issued to Vault residents, a miniaturized computer built into a wrist-mounted housing that has been engineered specifically for the conditions of post-nuclear survival. But the Pip-Boy's relationship to information is curiously selective, and what it chooses not to show you is, in certain respects, as interesting as what it does. The Pip-Boy does not show you time of day in a conventional sense. In many of the games it shows you a clock, but the relationship between that clock and narrative time, and between narrative time and environmental conditions, is managed through the game's systems rather than the device's display. More significantly, the Pip-Boy processes the world through a framework of game mechanics that smooths over the raw complexity of what your character is experiencing. In Fallout 4, when you drink irradiated water, the Pip-Boy updates your radiation counter. It does not show you the cumulative biological damage of 200 years of atmospheric radiation exposure that your body has been absorbing since you stepped out of the vault. It does not show you the long-term consequences of sleeping in rubble and eating food that has been irradiated for 2 centuries. The game simplifies these processes into manageable systems, and the Pip-Boy is the interface through which that simplification is presented. What this means for the fiction is interesting. The Pip-Boy is a pre-war device updated and maintained across 2 centuries of real-world game releases. Its interface, the green-lit screen, the rotating dials, the specific kind of chunky plastic housing is the visual design language that communicates this is the Fallout universe more efficiently than almost any other element. And it carries inside it a kind of epistemic limitation. It knows what it was built to know, and it presents that knowledge through the categories its designers anticipated. The categories the Pip-Boy's designers anticipated were pre-war categories. The device was built for Vault-Tec's vision of post-nuclear life. A limited survival situation, temporary, managed, eventually transitioning back into something recognizable as civilization. The Pip-Boy was not built for the permanent wasteland condition. It was built for a few hundred days of underground survival followed by a managed re-emergence. 200 years later, it is still running. It has never been updated. It is presenting the post-apocalyptic world through a framework that was designed for a crisis that was supposed to end quickly and did not. This is a metaphor that the games are probably not fully conscious of, but that operates throughout the franchise at a thematic level. The survivors of the Great War inherited a world and the tools to navigate it, but the tools were built for a different relationship with that world. The Pip-Boy's categories, quests, items, data were designed for the fiction of managed crisis. Applied to the real crisis of permanent post-nuclear life, they still function, but they function with gaps. They leave things unmeasured. They impose an order on experience that is not quite accurate. The original Nick Valentine carries a Pip-Boy, or rather the synth Nick Valentine's template mind carried the memory of using a Pip-Boy before the war. The device is a link between the pre-war world and the post-war one, and because Nick bridges both, his relationship to the Pip-Boy is perhaps the most complicated in the franchise. A pre-war person living in a post-war body, using a pre-war device to navigate a world that neither the device nor the body was designed for. There are terminal entries in Vault-Tec facilities that document the Pip-Boy's development history, the iterations of the design, the decisions about what capabilities to include, the cost calculations that determined which features were worth the manufacturing overhead. The Pip-Boy 3000, the model most prominently featured in the games, was developed through a series of prior models that each added or removed capabilities based on feedback from the Vault program's planning teams. What the development history reveals, if you read it carefully, is that the Pip-Boy is a survival device engineered around assumptions of temporary crisis. The battery life was designed for months, not centuries, and the devices you find running in 2287 are running on something that should have died decades ago. The water purification warnings were calibrated for contamination levels that the pre-war world considered severe but manageable. The radiation counters were calibrated for emergency exposure rather than chronic low-level radiation, which means the warnings and thresholds the device shows you are not quite accurate to the wasteland's actual conditions. The Pip-Boy is telling you the truth, as it understood it in 2077. The world has moved beyond that understanding in almost every dimension. But the device is what you have, and it is still useful, and the categories it offers are still better than nothing. There is a lesson in that, possibly. The tools you inherit from the world that ended are built around assumptions the new world does not share. You use them anyway, because they are what you have. You stay alert to the places where they fail to account for where you actually are. That vigilance, the awareness that the map is not the territory, that the Pip-Boy's categories are approximations, that the framework you were handed does not perfectly describe the world you are navigating, is perhaps the closest the Fallout universe comes to recommending a philosophy of its own. The device glows green on your wrist. It is doing its best. So are you. The wasteland goes on. It always goes on. Past the edges of every map, past the edges of every game, into the parts of the world that the franchise has not yet chosen to show us, there are 200 years of stories the games have only gestured at. Communities that survived in ways nobody anticipated. Technologies that evolved in directions Vault-Tec never predicted. Individuals who made choices in the dark that changed things in ways that the records, if any records survived, would not capture completely. That is what makes the Fallout universe what it is. Not the specific stories it tells, though those are rich and carefully constructed. It is the sense that the stories you can access are the edge of a much larger thing, that the capital wasteland and the Mojave and the Commonwealth and Appalachia are the places where the light was turned on, and beyond the light there is more world. There always is. These mysteries who fired first, what the vaults were really for, who the mysterious stranger is and why he keeps showing up, what house was actually building, what the courier left behind in the divide, what waits beneath Dunwich, what the Institute became and what it would have become, what the rest of the world looks like from outside the maps we have been given. These are not mysteries. The franchise will answer cleanly. They are not supposed to be answered cleanly. They are the texture of a world that is still alive, still running experiments, still broadcasting into empty air, still waiting for someone tuned to the right frequency to receive what it is sending. You have been listening for a while now. The frequencies are fading. The green light of the Pip-Boy is dimming slightly, the way it does when the power cells are running low. There is more out there. There is always more out there. If this helped you rest tonight, if you found yourself somewhere quieter inside all of this, leave a like so more people can find their way here. And if you want to keep exploring together, the subscribe button is right there. New territories ahead. Sleep well, wanderer. Watch the horizon. And maybe if you hear the guitar chord, brief and clear, somewhere in the dark, do not turn around too quickly. He is gone before you look. He always is. Section 20. The Followers of the Apocalypse, the faction nobody talks about enough. In the landscape of Fallout, New Vegas's competing ideologies, the Followers of the Apocalypse tend to get less attention than the NCR, the Legion, or Mr. House. They do not control an army. They do not have a fortified headquarters with a missile defense system. They are not building anything that will change the political balance of the Mojave in the next decade. What they are doing is keeping people alive. Quietly, consistently, without a lot of ideological fanfare. And the philosophy behind that work is one of the most interesting things any Fallout faction has ever articulated. The Followers were founded in the Los Angeles area in the early post-war period by survivors who decided that the most urgent task was not power or territory, but knowledge specifically, the kind of practical, medical, and agricultural knowledge that a population struggling to survive immediate threats desperately needed. They established themselves as healers and educators, moving through the wasteland without establishing defensive perimeters or claiming political authority, offering what they knew to whoever needed it. By the time of New Vegas, the Followers have been operating for generations, and their institutional culture reflects that span. They are careful observers. They have archives. They have a research tradition that takes the wasteland seriously as a subject of study rather than simply a problem to be managed. The doctors and scientists working for the Followers have spent decades developing medical techniques adapted to post-war conditions, treatments for radiation exposure, protocols for dealing with common wasteland injuries, approaches to infectious disease in populations without germ theory. The character Arcade Gannon, one of New Vegas's companions, is a Followers doctor with a complicated personal history. His father was a high-ranking Enclave officer, which gives him a perspective on the relationship between institutional power and personal ethics that is more nuanced than most. His recruitment into the Followers was, in some sense, an act of penance, choosing to dedicate his capabilities to an organization that explicitly opposed everything his father represented. Arcade's conversations with the Courier explore the Followers' philosophy in some depth. Their approach to the Wasteland's problems is specifically not the approach of the NCR. Build institutions, extend governance, impose order from above, or the Legion impose discipline by force, eliminate weakness, create hierarchy through violence, or House, manage everything from a position of technologically enforced authority. The Followers believe that the Wasteland's population has the knowledge and the capacity to solve its own problems, given access to information and basic resources. Their job is to expand that access. This is not a flashy vision. It does not produce dramatic set pieces or memorable monologues about destiny and empire. But it is, arguably, the most sustainable approach to the problem that any faction in the game articulates. The NCR's governance model requires a bureaucratic infrastructure that the organization is already struggling to maintain. The Legion's model requires Caesar, and Caesar is mortal, and the game shows you what happens when his leadership becomes uncertain. House's model requires House, which is a single point of failure so significant that House himself has spent 2 centuries engineering redundancy around it. The Followers' model requires nothing more than the conviction that sharing knowledge is worthwhile and the organizational capacity to do it consistently. It is not dependent on any single individual or on control of any specific piece of infrastructure. It is distributed and redundant in the way that only cultures, not governments or corporations, can be. The knowledge the Followers have distributed into the Wasteland's communities over generations does not disappear when an individual follower dies. It lives in the people who received it. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that the faction most committed to preserving and distributing human knowledge is also the faction least interested in political power. The Followers' choice to stay out of the conflict at Hoover Dam, their explicit refusal to pick a side in the showdown between the NCR, the Legion, and Mr. House is treated by the other factions as naivety, as a failure to recognize how the world works. But the followers have been operating successfully for longer than the NCR has existed as a formal government. Whatever the outcome at Hoover Dam, whoever controls the dam, whoever takes New Vegas, the followers will still be out there, treating patients, teaching crop rotation, delivering children, keeping records. The quiet persistence of the faction that chose people over politics is perhaps the Fallout universe's most understated argument. It does not get speeches or set pieces or dramatic endings. It just keeps going. Section 21, The Sounds of the Wasteland. What the music actually says. The music of the Fallout series is as specific to the franchise's identity as the Pip-Boy or the Power Armor or the Nuka-Cola vending machines. The pre-war music that plays from in-game radio stations, the swing, the big band, the crooners, the rockabilly, creates the specific temporal dislocation that defines the Fallout aesthetic. You are in a ruined world, but the music is from 1950. The culture preserved in the radio towers and the ruined jukeboxes is the culture that the bomb interrupted. Three Dogs Galaxy News Radio in Fallout 3 curates the pre-war music alongside his ongoing running commentary on the Capital Wasteland's current events, and the combination is specifically designed to make the wasteland feel inhabited in a way that pure environmental design could not achieve on its own. The music is company? It is the sense that somewhere, in a fortified studio above the ruins of DC, someone is paying attention. The New Vegas radio stations extend this approach significantly. Mr. New Vegas, the smooth-voiced radio host who plays music on Radio New Vegas, is in many ways Mr. House's most sophisticated public-facing communication tool, a persona crafted to make the Strip feel like a functioning entertainment destination rather than a heavily fortified economic zone managed by a 200-year-old man in a life support machine. But the music that gets discussed less is the atmospheric score, the ambient music that plays in the background of exploration, composed specifically for each game. In Fallout 3 and New Vegas, Enon Zur's compositions carry a specific emotional weight that the pre-war music does not. Where the pre-war music is nostalgic and slightly unsettling in its cheerfulness, joy preserved in amber, completely unaware of what came after, the ambient score is sorrowful in a way that is specifically modern. It knows about the ruins. It was written for them. The Fallout 3 score has a quality of mourning that is almost geological, it sounds like. Looking at the landscape rather than listening to it, like the audio equivalent of standing in the middle of what used to be Washington and watching the light change over the ruined dome of the Capitol. It is music about aftermath, about the specific silence that follows catastrophe after enough time has passed that the acute grief has faded, and what remains is the structural sadness of things that can never be repaired. New Vegas's score shifts this somewhat. There is still sorrow in it, but there is also something that the Capital Wasteland's music lacks: possibility. The Mojave is not a ruin, the same way DC is. It was damaged, but the damage was less total. Things survived that did not survive in the East, and the music reflects that. There is a quality of negotiation in New Vegas's ambient score, the sense of a world that is still in process, still trying to work out what it is going to become. Fallout 4's music, also by Zur, tends towards something heavier. The Commonwealth's ambient score has a weight that comes from both the physical environment, the ruins are denser, the combat is more constant, the sense of threat is more persistent, and from the narrative's emotional stakes. You are looking for your son. The music knows this. The compositions that play while you move through the Commonwealth are not just scoring a world, they are scoring a grief. What these scores tell you, cumulatively, is something about the franchise's relationship with its own subject matter. Fallout could have been scored as an action-adventure driving, propulsive, designed to heighten the excitement of exploration and combat. The choice to score it as elegy to make the music carry the weight of what was lost rather than the energy of what is being accomplished is a fundamental creative decision that shapes how the entire experience feels. You are not triumphant in the Fallout Wasteland, even when you win. The music does not let you be triumphant. The wasteland does not let you be triumphant. The best you can do is better than what came before, which is not nothing, but which the music correctly identifies as insufficient recompense for everything that was taken. The guitar riff that plays when the mysterious stranger appears is, in this context, the most precise single piece of music in the franchise. It is brief. It is jauntily melancholy. It sounds like something that knows it is here and gone. It sounds like a man in a trench coat who has been doing this for longer than anyone has been watching, and who does not require an audience to keep doing it, and who will be gone before you can ask him anything. That sound is 3 notes, maybe 4. They carry the entire mystery in them. Section 22. The Ghouls Who Remember. What Living Memory Does to a Person. There is a ghoul in Rivet City in Fallout 3 named Roy Phillips who is involved in a fairly low-key side quest about discrimination and housing rights. There is a ghoul in Underworld, the ghoul-exclusive settlement in the Museum of Natural History, named Carol, who runs a hotel and tells you that she knew your father James before either of them came to D.C. There are ghouls throughout every Fallout game who are not feral, who retain their cognitive function through the radiation transformation, who have been alive since before the bombs fell. These characters represent something unique in the Fallout universe. Living memory, not records or terminal entries or audio logs, actual people who were there, who remember what the world looked like before the mushroom clouds. Who were children in the 2070s and are still walking the wasteland in 2277 or 2287, 2 centuries later, carrying that knowledge in a body that barely resembles what they started with. The psychological weight of this is something the games do not always foreground, but that is present in the texture of every coherent ghoul's dialogue if you look for it. Carol in Underworld is an older woman who runs her hotel with the particular efficiency of someone who has had a very long time to develop their professional habits. She is kind, she is practical, she has opinions about the pre-war world that are the opinions of someone who was actually there, not someone who read about it or heard stories. She knew James, your father, the man you spend Fallout 3 looking for, whose voice you hear on logs, and whose memory lives in the Brotherhood of Steel members he worked with, and in the laboratory he never finished, and in you. Carol met him, probably talked to him, formed whatever impression a hotel keeper forms of a physicist who is passing through. She has 1 degree of direct lived connection to the person whose absence shapes the entire narrative. This is what the long-lived ghouls offer that nothing else in the wasteland can. Continuity. The vaults offer preservation, but at the cost of the preserved. The Brotherhood preserves technology, not people. The Enclave preserved institutional structure without the people it was supposedly governing. Only the coherent ghouls carry the actual lived substance of the world before the textures of daily life, the specific sensory memories, the way things felt before they changed. The tragedy is that the long-lived ghouls are increasingly alone. The world that they remember is gone in every meaningful sense. The buildings they remember as functional are ruins. The cities they remember as crowded are empty. The institutions they understood as permanent governments, corporations, universities are rubble or mythology. The people they knew in the pre-war world are dead, which in the Fallout universe means they have been dead for 2 centuries. And the new world, the post-war wasteland, knows the ghouls through the lens of their appearance first and their history second, if at all. The discrimination against ghouls that Fallout 3's Roy Phillips subplot explores is not incidental to the franchise's concerns. The most marginalized people in the post-war world are the ones who carry the most knowledge of what came before, and the ways in which that knowledge is inaccessible to a society built on survival pressure are significant and recurring. What would the wasteland look like if the institutional memory of the long-lived ghouls was systematically collected and distributed? If the communities of the NCR or the Commonwealth had access to the direct testimony of people who were alive before the war, who knew how the agricultural systems worked, who understood the logic of the institutions that failed, not through the propaganda that survives in pre-war media, but through lived experience and personal observation, the followers of the apocalypse, in their archival work, try to approximate this, but there is no equivalent of an oral history project in the Fallout wasteland. No organized effort to sit down with the coherent ghouls who are still alive in 2287 and record what they know before the last of them are gone. The irony is that the long-lived ghouls are the apocalypse's unwitting historians. They did not choose to survive. They did not choose to carry the memory. They just kept living, in the way that bodies will when the biology happens to favor survival, and what they carry in their radiation-preserved minds is a connection to a world that everyone else knows only through ruins and records. The wasteland is built on the absence of that world. But some of that absence walks around. It runs a hotel. It haggles with merchants. It sits in a bar and drinks something that tastes roughly like alcohol and remembers Tuesday morning. It was a regular morning. There were no signs. Section 23, What Happens After. The endings the games don't show you. Every Fallout game ends with slides. Text and images and a narrator's voice, describing the consequences of the choices you made. What happened to the people you helped or ignored or destroyed? What became of the factions you supported or undermined? How the region looks a decade or a generation after your story concluded. The slides are one of the franchise's most beloved formal choices. They feel like history, like someone, years after the events, assembling the record of what occurred. They have the emotional distance of aftermath, which is both comforting and occasionally devastating, because the aftermath of some choices is very bad, and the game makes you sit with that. But the slides are also incomplete. They show you the near-term consequences the decade after, maybe 2 decades. They do not show you the longer view. What happens 50 years after the courier decides the fate of the Mojave? What does the region look like a century after the lone wanderer activates the purifier? What survives of the factions and the individuals and the systems you set in motion in the span of time that Fallout's timeline covers? The Fallout universe is built across a sequence of games whose settings are separated by gaps of decades. Fallout is set in 2161, Fallout 2 inches 2241, Fallout 3 inches 2277, New Vegas and Fallout 4 inches 2287 and 2287. Fallout 76 is the earliest post-war game, set in 2102. Each game exists in the history of the others, the events of the first game are history by the time of the second, and so on. What this means is that some of the questions about what happens after have been answered, obliquely, by subsequent games. The Master's defeat in the first game is history by the time of Fallout 2, referenced but not centered. The rise of the NCR is one of those consequences the Republic emerged from the social and economic space created by the defeat of the first game's threats. The Enclave's defeat in Fallout 2 is referenced in Fallout 3 as background context for the faction's presence in the East. But New Vegas and Fallout 4 and 76 are the most recent events in the timeline, and nothing yet set in the franchise follows them. The questions about what happens after those games end are entirely open. Who controls the Mojave after New Vegas? What does the Commonwealth become after the events of Fallout 4? How does the history of Appalachia, established by Fallout 76, connect to the histories we know from the games set 2 centuries later? These are the mysteries that a franchise this long-lived accumulates over time, not just the lore mysteries within individual games, but the temporal mysteries created by having a continuous fictional history. Every event in the franchise's timeline is simultaneously a consequence of what came before and a cause of what comes after. The players who set the Mojave's future in New Vegas are shaping what a future game in the region might inherit. The choices made in the Commonwealth of Fallout 4 are the history that any future Boston set game would need to account for. This creates a strange relationship between the player and the franchise's future. The choices you made, the endings you experienced, exist as potential histories, as one of the possible pasts that the next game might choose to canonize or not. The franchise tends to resolve these by treating the ambiguous outcomes as ambiguous by designing future games to work regardless of which of multiple possible endings was the true one. But the question of what really happened in the Mojave after the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, of what the Commonwealth became after the Institute was destroyed or preserved or allied with, of who wrote the history that the next generation of wasteland survivors will have access to, that is a mystery the franchise carries in its future rather than its past. The endings it has not shown us yet are the ones we are still making. Every playthrough is a potential history. Every choice is a potential cause. The slide is still being written. The wasteland has been talking to us for a long time now. The radio signals, the terminal entries, the audio logs from people who did not know anyone would eventually listen, all of it adds up to something that is larger than any individual game or any individual mystery. It adds up to a world that was real and ended and kept going anyway. That found new ways to organize the surviving material, the land, the technology, the human beings who were stubborn enough or lucky enough or adaptively mutated enough to still be here 2 centuries later. That produced, in those survivors, exactly the same range of human behavior that produced the catastrophe in the first place. Ambition and generosity, cruelty and love, the capacity for institutions that last for generations, and the capacity for individuals who burn everything down. The mysteries are not separate from that story. They are made of it. Every unexplained radio signal is a person who was broadcasting to an audience that did not survive. Every sealed vault is an experiment that ended, one way or another, before the data could be properly analyzed. Every faction is a theory about how to survive the consequences of human nature, tested against the reality of what human nature actually produces under extreme conditions. The Fallout universe endures as a cultural object not because of its setting post-apocalyptic fiction is crowded, but because of its specificity. The Great War is not a generic nuclear war. It is a very particular war, with particular causes and particular consequences, and the 2 centuries of aftermath it produced are specific enough in their social and technological and biological details to feel like a real history rather than a backdrop. Real histories have mysteries. Real histories have questions that the available records cannot answer. Real histories have the quality of a world that was not designed to be legible, that generated its events through the collision of countless individual decisions that nobody had full visibility into, that accumulated complexity and contradiction in the way that living systems do. The Fallout universe feels like that. It feels like something that happened, even though it did not. And that feeling is why we keep going back. Why the terminals are still readable, and the signals are still tunable, and the vaults still have one more level we have not reached the bottom of. There is always one more level. There is always one more frequency. There is always something in the dark at the bottom of the stairs that you have not fully seen yet. The Pip-Boy light is low, but it is enough. Walk carefully. Keep the radio on. And if you find yourself in Dunwich, maybe do not go all the way to the bottom, or go. Learn what is down there. Just know that once you have seen it, you cannot unsee it. That is always how it is with the things worth knowing. If you made it this far 3 hours deep in the Fallout Wasteland's strangest corners, you are the exact kind of person this is made for. Leave a like if it helped you rest tonight, and subscribe if you want to keep going. There is more wasteland ahead. There is always more wasteland ahead. Sleep well. The mysterious stranger is watching. He always has been.